The auctioneer's hammer came down like a sentence with no appeal. $50. The man in the brown vest called out, his voice carrying the particular laziness of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Again. $50 for the widow and her boys. Do I hear 55? He did not hear 55. The crowd in Harlan's Crossing stood the way crowds stand when they have decided that what they are watching is not their problem. Men in work coats and Sunday hats. Women who had come to town for flour and thread and ended up witnessing something they would not speak of afterward. A few old-timers who had seen enough frontier injustice to know that silence was the safest position a man could hold. Evelyn Ashcroft stood on the wooden platform in the center of the square with her sons pressed against her sides. Owen on the left, Eli on the right. Both of them 8 years old and trying very hard not to shake, because she had asked them not to. She had asked them that morning when she dressed them in their cleanest clothes, the ones she had been saving, the ones that still smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where she had packed them after Thomas died. She had said, "Boys, whatever happens today, I need you to stand straight." And they were standing straight. That was the thing that nearly broke her. How well they were doing what she asked. Bernard Crail stood off to the side of the platform with his hands folded in front of him and an expression on his face that a stranger might have mistaken for boredom. He was not bored. Evelyn had learned in the weeks since Thomas's debts had passed into Crail's hands through mechanisms she still did not fully understand that Crail's boredom was always performance. The man was watching everything. I was watching the crowd. He was watching the auctioneer. He was watching her and the boys and the way Owen had taken hold of his brother's wrist when the bidding started, not to comfort him but because he needed something to hold on to. $50 final call, the auctioneer said, and lifted the hammer. If she had been asked beforehand what she would feel in this moment, she would have said terror. But terror had come and gone 3 weeks ago, when the sheriff arrived with the foreclosure papers, and Crail's man stood behind him with a smile that was not quite a smile. What she felt now, standing on the platform, was something colder and more specific. It was the feeling of a door closing. Not slamming, just closing, quietly, with the latch clicking into place. The hammer started its downward arc. "Hold it!" The voice came from the back of the crowd. Not loud, not particularly urgent. The kind of voice that did not need to raise itself because it had learned through long experience that people generally listened when it spoke. The crowd turned. A man had come through the gap between the feed store and the dry goods shop, and he was walking toward the platform at a pace that was neither rushed nor theatrical. He was somewhere in his late 30s, trail-worn in the way that meant he had been traveling for a while rather than for show. His coat was dusty. His boots had seen a great deal of ground. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to going places where other people had decided not to go. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at the auctioneer. "What's the debt?" he said. The auctioneer blinked. This was not a question he had been prepared for. "Sir, the bidding has concluded." "I didn't ask about the bidding. I asked about the debt." The man looked past the auctioneer to where Crail stood, and something passed between them that Evelyn could not fully read. "How much does she owe you?" Crail took one slow step forward. "This is a private matter," he said, "conducted under legal." "I'm not asking about the legality. I'm asking about the number." The man reached into his coat and produced a folded document, which he held up without opening it. "Because I have something that belongs to you, or that you think belongs to you, and I'd like to discuss a trade." The square had gone very quiet. Evelyn looked at this stranger, this dusty, unhurried man who had walked out of the gap between two buildings and stopped a hammer with his voice, and she did not know what to make of him. She would spend a long time afterward trying to reconstruct the first impression, and the honest answer was that she had no impression. He was simply there, where before there had been nothing. "What do you think you're doing?" Crail said, and his voice had changed. The performance of boredom was gone. The man looked at him steadily. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn and at the boys. Owen was staring at him with the particular intensity of a child who has decided to pay attention. Eli had gone very still. "I'm buying," the man said, and then he said it. The words that the crowd would repeat for years in various versions of the story, each version slightly different, all of them remembering the same essential fact. "They're my family now." The square erupted, not in applause, in laughter. The rough, disbelieving kind that men produce when they have witnessed something absurd and are not sure whether to be angry about it. Someone shouted something obscene. Someone else told him he was a fool. The auctioneer looked at Crail, and Krail's expression had gone completely still, which was worse than the anger would have been. The man did not react to any of it. He was looking at Evelyn. She could not have explained later what made her nod. She could not have told you whether it was trust or desperation or simply the recognition that the hammer had been stopped and she had nowhere else to turn. But she nodded, and he saw it, and he turned back to Krail. "Now," he said, "about that debt." His name was Cole Maddox, and he had not planned any of this. That was the part that no one would have believed if she had told them, and she didn't tell them for a long time. They would have expected a story, a man with a history, a purpose, some long-laid plan to save a woman and her children from a corrupt land baron in a forgotten frontier town. The truth was considerably more ordinary and considerably more frightening. He had ridden into Harlan's Crossing that morning, looking for a farrier because one of his horses had thrown a shoe 2 days east, and he had been nursing it along on the trail. He had come through the square because it was the direct route to the livery. He had seen the platform and the crowd, and the widow with her 2 boys, and the auctioneer with his hammer, and he had stopped. He could not have told you exactly why he stopped. He had a theory about it, which he did not share for some time, and the theory had to do with a morning 8 years earlier when he had failed to stop something and had been thinking about it, in the way that men think about their failures ever since. But that was his business, not anyone else's, and he kept it to himself for longer than was perhaps advisable. What he could tell you was what he had seen on that platform. He had seen a woman who was not crying, which told him something. He had seen 2 boys who were trying to hold still for her, which told him something else. And he had seen Bernard Krail standing off to the side with folded hands and a performance of indifference, and something about Krail, the posture, the particular brand of self-satisfaction that comes from a man who has done this before and expects to do it again, had decided something in Cole Maddox before he'd had time to think about it. That was the problem with most of the important decisions he had made in his life. He made them before he'd had time to think about them. The negotiation with Krail took 45 minutes in the back room of the Harlan's Crossing Sheriff's Office, which was the only neutral space either of them could agree on, and it was not pleasant. Cole had in his possession a land deed that Krail's operation had been trying to acquire for the better part of a year, a strip of grazing land in the Eastern Valley that controlled access to the only reliable water source in a 20-mile radius. Cole had come by it through means that were technically legal and practically complicated, and he had been intending to sell it to a rancher further north who had offered a fair price. He traded it to Krail instead, along with a sum of cash that represented nearly everything he had liquid, in exchange for the Ashcroft debt being declared settled and all claims on the widow and her sons permanently relinquished. Krail took the deal. He took it in the way that a man takes a deal when he believes he has gotten the better of the other party, which meant he took it with the expression of a man who is pretending not to be pleased. Cole recognized the expression and said nothing. Outside, Evelyn was waiting with the boys in the narrow strip of shade beside the sheriff's office. She had not been invited into the negotiation, which she had opinions about, and she did not keep those opinions entirely to herself when he came out. "You could have told me what you were offering," she said. "Wouldn't have changed anything. I'd have known what was being traded on my behalf." He looked at her. She was angular in the way that hard years make a person angular, and there were shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with the morning's events and everything to do with the weeks before them. She was holding herself very straight, the same way she had asked the boys to hold themselves, and he had the impression that the straightness was the only thing currently holding her together. "Fair enough," he said. "Water rights. East Valley Strip. About 4,000 acres. She stared at him. "That's worth more than $50. Yes." Owen was looking up at him. Eli was looking at the ground, which Cole would later learn was his habitual posture when he was thinking hardest about something. "Why did you do that?" Owen asked. The question was entirely direct and entirely genuine, the way children's questions are before they learn to wrap them in social cushioning. Cole thought about it for a moment. "I had the thing he wanted," he said, "and I didn't want you to go wherever he was sending you." "Where was he sending us?" Eli said, still looking at the ground. "I don't know exactly." Cole looked at Evelyn when he said it, and she looked back at him with an expression that said she had some idea, and the idea was bad enough that she did not want to describe it in front of the boys. "Somewhere that wasn't good for you." "Are you really going to say we're your family?" Owen asked. "I said it in front of a lot of people. Hard to take back." "But do you mean it?" It was, Cole thought, an extraordinarily reasonable question from an 8-year-old. "I mean, you're coming with me," he said. "Whether that's family or something else, I guess we'll figure out." It was not a good answer. Owen seemed to accept it anyway, which said something about the state of the alternatives. Cole's ranch was 3 hours north of Harlan's Crossing, and the ride there was quiet in the way that long rides are quiet when the people involved are not yet sure of each other. Evelyn rode beside him on a horse he had hired from the livery, and the boys rode double behind her on a gentle roan mare that he had judged unlikely to do anything stupid. The land changed as they went, flattening out from the scrub and dust of the town into the longer grasses of the valley floor, and the afternoon light did what afternoon light does in that country. Turned everything copper and clean in a way that made it look like somewhere a person could start over. He watched her take it in without seeming to watch her. She was cataloging, he could see that. Looking at the land the way a practical person looks at it. Not for beauty, but for information. Water sources. Fence lines. The state of the grass. The kind of woman who runs a ranch, or who has run one, looks at landscape differently from the kind who has only visited it, and Evelyn Ashcroft had run Thomas Ashcroft's cattle operation for the last 3 years of his life, managing the accounts, and the hands, and the purchasing decisions while he had been too sick to do it himself. Cole didn't know this yet. He would learn it over time, but he could see the shape of it and how she looked. The ranch itself was not impressive in the way that prosperous ranches are impressive. It was functional. The main house was solid and dry and had a new roof, which told you where the money had gone when there was money. The outbuildings were in reasonable repair. The fencing was decent. There was a vegetable garden on the south side of the house that had been let go for a while, 2 months, maybe 3, and showed it, the weeds having made their steady claims while no one was looking after it. "You live here alone?" Evelyn said. "Since my ranch hand left in the spring." "Why did he leave?" "Got a better offer." Cole swung down from his horse and tied it to the post. "There's 2 bedrooms. You and the boys take them. I'll use the—" "I'm not taking your bedroom." "It's not my bedroom. It was my hands." She looked at him for a moment. Then she climbed down from her horse without accepting the help he did not offer, because he had already figured out she would prefer he didn't. "How long are you expecting us to stay?" she asked. "I don't know." "You should know." "Probably," he said. "I'll think about it." Owen had already gotten down and was looking at the outbuildings with an expression of inventory, cataloging the same way his mother cataloged, which was interesting. Eli had gotten down quietly and was standing close to Evelyn's side, not holding her hand but near enough that he could if he needed to. "There are cattle?" Evelyn asked. 70 head, down from 112 in the spring. "What happened to them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Things got complicated," he said. She looked at him, and he could see she understood that this was not the full answer, and that he was not going to provide the full answer right now, and she made the decision to let it go for the moment. He appreciated that. People who needed every answer immediately were exhausting, and he had spent most of his adult life in the company of people or in enough solitude to know the difference. "The garden needs work," she said. "I know. I can do it. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She said it simply, not with irritation, but with a finality that indicated the subject was closed. "I don't know how to do nothing. I've never been good at it." He believed her. The first sign of trouble came 4 days later, which was faster than he had expected, and also, in some way he didn't want to examine, exactly as fast as he had expected. It came in the form of Jonas Weber, who owned the farm nearest to Cole's ranch, and who had been on reasonable terms with Cole for 2 years. Weber rode up to the fence line in the early morning while Cole was checking the cattle and stood there without dismounting, which was the gesture of a man who had decided he was not staying. "You got a woman and kids up at your place," Weber said. "I do." "People are saying she's the Ashcroft widow, that you took her from Harlan's Crossing without any legal—" "She left willingly." Cole kept his attention on the fence post he was checking. The wire was loose at the 3rd staple, which he had known for a week and hadn't gotten to. "Crail cleared the debt. I have the paperwork." "Crail's saying different." Cole looked up at that. He looked at Weber, who was a decent enough man, and could see on Weber's face the particular discomfort of a person who is delivering news he doesn't entirely believe himself, but feels he has to pass along anyway. "What is Crail saying?" "That you rode into town and took her by force. That there wasn't any negotiation. That she and the boys are being held against their will." Weber paused. "He's got a reward out, $50, which I suppose is the same amount as—" "I know what it is," Cole said. Weber was quiet for a moment. "I'm not coming for it," he said, and Cole believed him. but there are men who will. I know. Cole. Weber leaned slightly forward on his saddle. Whatever you did, and I don't know the full story, this is going to come back at you hard. Crail doesn't let things go. You know that. I know that too. So what's your plan? It was the same question Owen had asked, in different words, and Cole had the same insufficient answer. I'm working on it. Weber looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward his farm without another word, and Cole watched him go with the specific feeling of a man watching a door close that will not reopen easily. He went back to the fence post. The wire was loose at the third staple. He fixed it. That evening, Evelyn came and found him in the barn where he was working late on the tack, a job that had been waiting for weeks, and that he was using now as an excuse to stay busy while he thought. She came in without announcing herself and sat on the hay bale near the door and watched him work for a minute before she spoke. Weber came by this morning, she said. I saw him. I know. What did he say? Cole told her. He told her all of it, including the reward and what it meant, and he told it to her straight without softening it, because she had struck him, in 4 days, as the kind of woman who preferred reality to comfort. He was right about that. She sat on the hay bale and listened to all of it without her expression changing much, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. He's saying you kidnapped us, she said. Yes. That's insane. You have the papers. Papers can be argued about. Stories travel faster than papers. He set down the piece of tack he had been working on and looked at her. What you need to understand is that Crail has done this before. Not exactly this, but versions of it. He's good at it. He knows which parts of a story to tell and which parts to leave out. She absorbed this. What were you going to do if I'd said no, on the platform? The question surprised him. I hadn't thought that far. You spent 4,000 acres of water rights without thinking past the first step. Approximately, yes. Something passed across her face that might have been the beginning of a smile, except that the situation wasn't funny enough to let it all the way through. You're either very brave or very stupid, she said. Probably some of both. He picked up the tack again. Get some sleep. Tomorrow I need to go into Ridgemore and file some things at the county office, and I want to leave early. What kind of things? The kind that make it harder for Crail to tell only the parts of the story he wants to tell. She stood up from the hay bale, and at the door she paused without turning around. Cole. It was the first time she had used his name. He noticed. Whatever this is, whatever you thought you were doing when you said those words, I need you to understand that I'm not going to spend the rest of my time here being grateful. I'm going to work. I'm going to pull my weight. And if there's something I need to know, I need you to tell me. Understood, he said. Good. She went back to the house. He worked for another hour in the barn, and the cattle shifted in their stalls, and outside the wind moved through the long grass in the particular way it did at night. And Cole Maddox sat with the knowledge that he had made an irreversible decision and that the consequences were going to be significant and possibly catastrophic, and he felt, underneath all of that, something he could not quite name. Some stubborn, quiet thing that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but was something in between. He picked up the next piece of tack and kept working. In the house, Eli lay awake in the dark listening to his brother breathe and thought about the man in the barn. He had not said much to Cole in 4 days. He was a boy who thought before he spoke, who watched before he decided, who had learned early that the most useful information usually came in the quiet before people remembered you were paying attention. What he had seen in 4 days was this: a man who fixed things when they were broken. A man who didn't explain himself much. A man who had looked at his mother on that platform and done something about it without waiting to see if someone else would. He didn't know yet what that meant, but he thought it probably meant something. He closed his eyes and listened to the ranch settle around them in the dark. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like an emptiness. It felt like something waiting to become what it was going to be. The trip to Ridgemore took Cole the better part of a day, and he left before the boys were awake. Evelyn heard him go. She had not been sleeping deeply. She had not been sleeping deeply since Thomas got sick 2 years ago now, and the habit of light sleep had settled into her like a new bone, permanent and aching. And she heard the horse move out of the yard at first light and lay there in the dark, listening to it fade. She did not get up. There was nothing useful she could do about it, and she had stopped doing things that weren't useful somewhere around the time the ranch started failing. She got up when it was light enough to see the garden, and she went out with the hose she had found in the outbuilding, and she started working. The garden was worse than it had looked from horseback. The weeds had not merely moved in. They had settled, established roots, made themselves at home in the way that opportunistic things do when no one is paying attention. She worked through the cool of the morning and into the heat, and the boys came out at some point, and she put them to work pulling the smaller stuff by hand, which they did without much complaint. Owen worked fast and a little carelessly. Eli worked slowly and got every root. "Is he coming back?" Owen asked at one point, not looking up from the weed he was pulling. "Of course he's coming back." "How do you know?" Evelyn drove the hoe into the ground. "Because he left his cattle here," she said. "People don't abandon their cattle." Owen considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Pa abandoned ours," he said. "Pa didn't abandon them. Pa died." She said it without softness, because she had found that softness around the fact of it did not help them and had not helped her. "That's different." Eli said nothing. He pulled his weed out completely, roots and all, and set it aside and moved to the next one. They worked until midday. Evelyn made them come inside out of the heat, and she found bread and dried beef in Cole's larder and made something approximating a meal out of it, and she sat at the table in his kitchen and looked at what he had and what he didn't have, and started making a list in her head, because lists were the thing that kept her functional when everything else was uncertain. The larder was adequate for a single man and insufficient for 4 people. That would need to be addressed. The kitchen itself was clean in the way that a man's kitchen is clean when he has few enough things that disorder is hard to achieve, not truly organized, just sparse. There was a good cast iron pan, which told her something. There was coffee, which told her something else. There was a jar of honey that was nearly empty and a tin of tobacco that was full, and she looked at that tin for a moment and then looked away, because Thomas had smoked, and the smell of tobacco was still one of those things that went sideways on her when she wasn't prepared. She was not going to be sentimental about this. She had decided that. She had decided it on the platform in Harlan's Crossing while the auctioneer's hammer was in the air, and she had not unmade the decision since. Cole came back at dusk, and he came back with 2 things she hadn't expected. A deputy sheriff named Roy Alcott, who rode beside him with the particular posture of a man doing something he was not sure was within his authority, and a document case tucked under Cole's arm that was fat enough to suggest he had been busy in Ridgemore. He tied his horse, and Alcott tied his, and they came into the yard, and Cole looked at Evelyn standing on the porch and said, "Deputy Alcott is going to take a statement, from you, about what happened in Harlan's Crossing." She looked at Alcott. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s, with a face that had not yet fully committed to the expression of authority his badge required. "Ma'am," he said. "Come inside," she said. The statement took an hour. Alcott wrote everything down in a notebook with a pencil that he sharpened twice during the conversation, and he asked his questions carefully and listened to the answers without interrupting, which she appreciated. She told him about the foreclosure. She told him about Crail's men arriving at the ranch with papers that she had not been given time to properly review. She told him about the 2 weeks in Harlan's Crossing where she and the boys had been housed in a room above the feed store while Crail's operation processed what it called the debt settlement. She told him about the platform. "Were you given any choice in the matter?" Alcott asked. "Before Mr. Maddox intervened." "No." "Were you threatened?" She thought about how to answer that. "Not with specific words," she said. "But I was told that the settlement of the debt would involve placement, for myself and my sons. I asked what placement meant, and I was told it meant a work arrangement in another county. I asked for details, and was told the details were not my concern." Alcott's pencil stopped. He looked up at her. "Work arrangement," he said, and his voice had changed slightly. "That's what they called it." He wrote it down. He wrote it down slowly, and she could see he was thinking about it while he wrote, and thinking about it was changing something in his face. He was young, but he was not stupid. He knew what that meant. Any person with working eyes and a functioning mind knew what that meant when it came out of an operation like Crail's. Cole was in the kitchen while this was happening, making coffee, and she could hear him moving around and was aware of his awareness of the conversation and grateful for the specific quality of his restraint, the way he stayed in the kitchen and let her speak for herself. When Alcott was done, he sat for a moment looking at his notebook. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "I want to be honest with you. I don't have jurisdiction in Harlan's Crossing. That's Crail's county. And Crail has relationships with the sheriff there that make any investigation from outside complicated," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am." "But the county recorder in Ridgemore does have jurisdiction over land documents," Cole said from the doorway. He was holding 2 cups of coffee and he offered one to Alcott, who took it. And the debt papers Crail used to seize the Ashcroft Ranch were filed there. I had a conversation with the recorder this afternoon about some irregularities in the filing dates. Alcott looked at him. What kind of irregularities? The kind where the date on the filed document is 3 weeks before the date on the original agreement, which would mean Crail had a lien on the Ashcroft property before Thomas Ashcroft had signed anything. The room was quiet. That's fraud, Alcott said. Yes, Cole said. It is. Evelyn sat very still. She had known, in the vague and terrible way you know things when you are in the middle of them with no time to think clearly, that something about the foreclosure had been wrong. She had not known specifically what. She had not had time to find out, and then Crail's men had arrived, and then there was the room above the feed store, and then the platform. Hearing it stated plainly, fraud, was like finally seeing the shape of the thing that had been standing in the dark behind her for months. I need to make some additional inquiries, Alcott said carefully. He closed his notebook. In the meantime, Mr. Maddox, I'd strongly recommend— I know what I'd recommend, Cole said. We're being careful. After Alcott left, the house was quiet. The boys had eaten and gone to bed early, worn out from the garden work, and Evelyn and Cole sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the coffee and the document case open between them. Cole had spread out several papers, copies of the filed deed, the original agreement, a letter from the county recorder that was careful in its language but unmistakable in its implications. How did you know to look at the filing dates? She asked. I didn't, at first. The recorder mentioned it. He'd noticed the discrepancy months ago and hadn't been sure what to do about it. Cole turned one of the papers so she could see it better. Crail's done this before. Not here, further south. There are 3 other ranches in the Eastern Valley with similar filings. I found 2 of them today. She looked at the papers. Her handwriting was on one of them. The original agreement, Thomas's signature at the bottom, her witness signature beside it. She remembered the day he had signed it. He had been in bed, and she had brought the papers to him, and his hand had been shaking. She had held the page steady. This is bigger than us, she said. Yes. You knew that when you filed the statement. I suspected it. She looked at him across the table. He had the particular stillness of a person who is comfortable with silence, which she had noticed in the first days in which she had been sorting out what to make of. Thomas had been a talker, warm and expansive and filling rooms with words, which she had loved about him, and which had driven her faintly crazy, and which she missed in ways she was not prepared to discuss with anyone. Cole Maddox was the opposite of that. He said the thing he meant, and then stopped. And the stopping was not coldness, just economy, and she was still calibrating her response to it. What happens if the filing inquiry goes nowhere? She asked. Then we find another angle. He gathered the papers and put them back in the case. There's always another angle. The problem is usually time. Meaning Crail won't wait. No, he won't. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. Her hands were not pretty. They had not been pretty for years. They were the hands of someone who had worked a ranch in a drought, and she had stopped being self-conscious about them sometime in the 2nd year of the drought, when self-consciousness had become a luxury she couldn't afford. All right, she said. All right, what? All right, we find another angle, and another one after that if we need it. She stood up from the table. I want to see the Eastern Valley parcels you found. The other ranches. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, a slight recalibration, as though he was adjusting his understanding of her by a small but significant degree. I can take you tomorrow. Good. She picked up the coffee cups. Drink your coffee. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't slept much. Then do that. She went to the sink. The garden's coming back, she said, not turning around. It'll take another week, but it's coming back. I noticed. She rinsed the cups and put them to dry and went to bed. And she lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about fraud and filing dates and the shape of things that had been done to her and her boys in the name of legal process. And she felt something that wasn't grief and not fear, but something harder and more useful. She had felt it before. It was the feeling she'd had in the 2nd year of the drought, when the water table dropped and she had gone to the bank alone because Thomas was too sick, and the bank manager had explained the situation to her in the tone men use when they are explaining things to women they don't expect to understand. She had gone home and read every document in Thomas's files for 3 days straight and found 2 errors in the bank's calculations that she had corrected in writing, which had bought them 8 months. She was very good at finding errors. She closed her eyes and slept. And for the first time since Thomas died, it was asleep without the specific weight of impending catastrophe pressing down on it. Not because the catastrophe was gone, but because she was no longer facing it alone. Quiet. The first hired gun showed up 9 days after Cole's trip to Ridgemore. Cole saw him first, a man sitting a horse at the south end of the property line, just visible from the barn where Cole was working in the early morning. He was not doing anything. He was simply sitting there watching, in the patient way of a man who has been paid to watch, rather than to act. Cole went on with his work. An hour later, the man was gone. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. On the fourth morning, there were 2 of them. Cole told Evelyn about it that evening. He told it simply and without the softening he might have attempted with another woman, because he had learned by now that Evelyn preferred facts to reassurance. She listened, and then she said, "They're counting our habits." "Yes. When we leave, when we come back, where the boys go. Whether you're armed when you go to the fence line." "Yes," he said again. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you?" "Am I what?" "Armed when you go to the fence line." "I have been, since Weber's visit." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing information. "We need to change our patterns," she said. "If they're counting habits, give them different ones." It was, he thought, a completely sound tactical observation from a woman who had never, as far as he knew, been in a situation requiring tactical thinking. Or maybe she had. He was still learning the inventory. They changed the patterns. Cole varied his fence-checking times. Evelyn started taking the boys for their morning lesson at different hours each day, using the interior rooms rather than the yard when she felt the observation was active. She had begun teaching the boys in the evenings, reading, figures, some geography, using the books she found in Cole's shelf, which were few but adequate. A history, a surveying manual, a worn novel whose cover was gone. She taught with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had been taught the same way, and Owen argued with her regularly about the geography because he was that kind of student, and Eli absorbed everything silently and demonstrated his comprehension by asking, at the end of each session, one question that showed he had understood not just the surface of the thing, but the thing underneath it. The third week brought something worse than watchers. A man named Denton, who ran the supply store in the nearest town, refused Cole's order. He did not refuse it loudly or with explanation. He simply did not fill it, and when Cole came to collect it, Denton said there had been a problem with the stock, which was obviously untrue because Cole could see the flour sacks on the shelf from where he was standing. Cole looked at Denton, and Denton looked at the counter, and the conversation they didn't have said everything that needed to be said. He rode to the next town, 15 miles further, and got what he needed there. He came back and told Evelyn, and she put the supplies away without comment. But the next day she rode to Weber's farm while Cole was working, and she knocked on the door, and when Mrs. Weber answered, a broad, capable-looking woman named Ruth, who had the eyes of a person who misses nothing, Evelyn said, "I know your husband told Cole to be careful. I'm not here to argue about that. I'm here because I need to know who in this valley is decent and who is afraid and who is Crails." Ruth Weber looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "You'd better come in." She was gone for 2 hours. She came back with a list in her head, not written down because written lists could be found, of 4 families who could be trusted and 3 who could not, and 2 who were afraid enough that they might go either way depending on how the wind was blowing. She told Cole that evening. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "You shouldn't have gone alone." "I know," she said, "but Ruth Weber wouldn't have talked the same way with you there." He thought about that. "True," he said after a moment. "I'm going to visit the others, one at a time, casually, on the pretext of borrowing or returning something." She had already borrowed a bread pan from Ruth, which gave her a reason to return it. People talk differently to women making neighborly calls than to men making inquiries. "They do," he said, "so let me do this." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the risk of her going out, the risk of not knowing who could be trusted, the balance between the two. This was something she had come to observe about Cole Maddox. He was not a man who made fast decisions when the stakes were high. He was careful. He thought before he moved. It should have been reassuring, and it mostly was, except on the days when she wanted him to simply say yes or no, and he needed another 30 seconds to think. "All right," he said, "but tell me where you're going every time, and take Owen." "Owen's 8. He's observant and he's fast, and nobody watches children the way they watch adults." He paused. "Tell him it's a job. He'll take it seriously." She did tell him it was a job. Owen straightened up in the way he straightened up when he felt important, which was often, and appropriately, and said that he understood. Eli asked if he could come. Evelyn said one of them needed to stay with Cole, and Eli nodded like this was a reasonable division of labor, which it was. The visits took 2 weeks, and what Evelyn came back with was worth every mile of it. The Harding family had lost a parcel of grazing land 18 months ago. Land they had owned for 12 years, lost through a debt claim that the eldest son said had appeared on documents he had never signed. The Porters had a neighbor who had simply vanished after refusing to sell to Crail's agent, and the land had been absorbed into Crail's holding 6 weeks later on a disputed deed. Agnes Kimball, who was 70 and alone since her husband passed, and whom everyone called Miss Agnes, had kept copies of everything. Every document, every letter, every piece of correspondence related to her late husband's dealings in the valley over 30 years. She kept them in a tin box under her floor. Why? Evelyn asked her. Miss Agnes looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has outlived most of her contemporaries and is therefore not easily surprised. Because my husband didn't trust any of them, she said, and he was usually right. The tin box had things in it that stopped Evelyn's breath. It had a letter dated 6 years back from a man named Harlan Crail, Bernard's father, who had founded the operation, to a county recorder who was no longer the county recorder, about the systematic acquisition of Eastern Valley parcels through debt consolidation and document manipulation. It was not a confessional letter. It was a business letter, written in the flat, procedural language of a man who did not think what he was doing was wrong, which was in some ways worse. It laid out the scheme with the casual specificity of someone describing an accounting method. "May I borrow this?" Evelyn asked. "You may have it," Miss Agnes said. "I've been waiting for someone to ask." She rode back with Owen, who was quiet beside her on the roan with the particular quiet that meant he was thinking. When they were nearly home, he said, without preamble, "That old lady had something important, didn't she?" "Yes." "Is it going to help?" "I think so." He was quiet another moment. "Cole said the problem is usually time," he said. "That there's always another angle, but the problem is time." She looked at him. "When did he say that?" "Yesterday, when I asked him how things worked with land and lawyers and such." Owen shrugged in the way he shrugged when he was pretending something was casual. "I ask him things sometimes." She looked back at the trail. "Good," she said. "Keep asking." Long. The supplies stopped entirely in the 5th week, not just from Denton, from everyone within reasonable riding distance. Cole made 3 trips to find that the story had spread. Crail's version of it, the one where Cole Maddox had kidnapped a widow and her children and was holding them on his ranch while the county failed to act. The one constructed with the specific precision of a man who knew how to use a story the way other men used a weapon. By the 5th week, it had covered enough ground that Cole couldn't buy provisions within a day's ride in any direction without getting a door shut in his face or a price so inflated it amounted to the same thing. He came back from the 3rd trip and put what he had on the table and looked at it and then went out to the barn. Evelyn found him there an hour later, not doing anything specific, just standing with one hand on the stall post looking at nothing in particular. She had seen this once before, 3 days after they arrived, when he had gone quiet for an evening, and she had eventually learned it had to do with the ranch hand who'd left, and why. And she recognized it now as the posture of a man who was recalculating. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking the food situation is a problem." "I know it's a problem. What are you thinking about doing about it?" He turned and looked at her. There was something tired around his eyes that had been there for a week, and that he was managing, she thought, with the effort of a man who has decided tiredness is not useful information to share. "I can get to the Ridgemore market if I leave before dawn and ride hard. Once a week. It's a long day." "Then do that." She crossed her arms. "What else?" "The men at the fence line. There are 3 of them now, and they've been there every morning for 11 days. That's expensive. That's not surveillance. That's preparation." She understood what he meant. She had understood it since the 2nd week, in the way you understand things you wish you didn't. "Crail's going to move," she said. "Soon. He's spent enough on the watchers and the supply blockade that he needs something to show for it." "What does he want most?" "The property. Or us gone. Either one." "He can't have us gone legally. You have the settlement papers." "Legal and practical are different things," Cole said. "You know that." She did know that. She had learned it in stages over the past 5 weeks. each stage adding a new dimension to her understanding of what they were actually facing. It was not just a corrupt land baron with a fraudulent debt scheme. It was a system, relationships, arrangements, mutual interests among men who had decided that the rules applied to some people and not to others, and that the distinction was a matter of power rather than principle. She had understood this abstractly before Thomas died. She understood it concretely now, with the specific and clarifying understanding of a person to whom it is being done. Ruth Weber told me something last week, she said. I didn't mention it because I was still thinking about it. Cole waited. She said Crail has been buying up valley land for 3 years. Not just the small parcels, the ranches with water access. All of it pointing toward controlling the Valley Creek system. If he controls the creek access, every ranch downstream is dependent on him. He can charge for water, or he can cut it off. Cole was very still. She's sure of that. Her husband figured it out 6 months ago. I didn't know what to do about it. Evelyn unfolded her arms and put her hands in her coat pockets because they were cold and because it was something to do with them. The letter I brought back from Miss Agnes. It's the same scheme. It's been running for 6 years at least. What we're seeing isn't opportunism. It's the end of a plan. Cole was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she started to wonder if she had miscalculated in telling him, if it was too much at once, the kind of thing that overwhelmed rather than clarified. Then he said, How many copies can you make of that letter? By hand? As many as you need. I write quickly. I need 4. 1 for the county recorder in Ridgemore, 1 for the state land office, 1 for a lawyer I know in Cartwell who has been looking at water rights cases for 2 years, and 1 to keep here, hidden. That's 4, she said. Yes. When do you need them? Before Crail moves, he paused, which means before the end of the week, if I'm reading the situation right. She nodded. I'll start tonight. She did start that night, and she wrote by the light of the lamp at the kitchen table while Cole cleaned his rifle at the other end and the boys slept. And the house was quiet in a way that felt provisional, like the quiet before a storm gets close enough to hear. She wrote carefully and quickly, copying Miss Agnes's document exactly. Every word, every comma, the specific flat business language of the elder Crail that was somehow more damning for its plainness. Owen came out at some point, sleepless, and stood in the doorway and looked at them both. Cole looked up. Back to bed, he said, not unkindly. I heard something outside, Owen said. Cole was already up and at the window in the way he moved when he moved fast. No wasted motion, no drama, just immediate purposeful action. He looked out for a long time. Then he said, Dog got into something. Go to sleep. Owen went back. Evelyn kept writing. After a minute, Cole sat down again and picked up the rifle cloth. He's not sleeping much, she said without looking up from the page. I know. He worries. He's 8. He shouldn't have to. No. She turned the page. But he does. Cole was quiet for a moment. He's a good kid. He's a difficult kid. She kept writing. He's also a good one, both at once. She paused. Eli's easier to be around. But Owen sees things. He sees them before most adults would. It gets him into trouble. Gets him into trouble how? He says what he sees, directly, without the social cushioning. She glanced up briefly. Rather like someone else I've met recently. Cole looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, somewhere behind his eyes. I'll take that as a characterization rather than a complaint. It was both, she said, and went back to writing. She finished the 4th copy at an hour that was closer to morning than night, and she put the pages in the document case with the others, and she blew out the lamp and went to bed. Cole was still at the table. She thought, as she went down the hall, that she should say something. Something that acknowledged the specific absurdity and difficulty and occasional inadvertent humanity of the situation they were in, this stranger's house, and this stranger's kitchen, and these copies of a 6-year-old letter that might be the thing that saved them, or might be the thing that was found too late. She didn't say it. She went to bed. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning with a cold sky and a wind coming from the north, Cole came in from the fence line with his coat muddy, and his expression closed in the way it got when something had happened and he was deciding how to tell it. She looked up from the table where she was helping Eli with figures. Cole glanced at the boys and she said, Owen, take your brother outside for a bit. Why? Owen said. Because I'm asking you to. They went. Cole sat down across from her and put both hands flat on the table. There were 4 of them this morning, he said. Not at the fence line, at the creek crossing, on our side. She absorbed this. On our side meant inside the property boundary. It meant the watchers had become something else. Anyone you recognized? One of them. He rides for a man named Garrett, who works Crail's operation in the southern county. Cole looked at his hands on the table. They weren't armed, that I could see. But they weren't there for the scenery. A message, she said. Yes. The kind that means the next visit is different. She sat with this for a moment. She sat with the specific weight of it, the accumulated weight of 5 weeks of blocked supplies and watchers, and a fraudulent debt scheme and a letter copied 4 times by lamplight, all of it leading to this. 4 men at the creek crossing on their side of the fence, not armed because they didn't need to be yet. She put her hand on the table near his, not touching, just near. The copies are ready, she said. All 4. I'll ride to Ridgemore tomorrow. We'll ride to Ridgemore tomorrow, she said. He started to say something and then stopped. He looked at her hand near his on the table. All right, he said. The boys can stay with Ruth Weber, she offered. You arranged that already. Yesterday. She pulled her hand back. I told you. I'm not good at doing nothing. He nodded slowly, and she saw it again. That slight recalibration, that adjustment of his understanding of her by some small but significant degree. He did it every time she was ahead of where he expected her to be, and she had stopped being either pleased or irritated by it, and had simply started to find it interesting. The way you find interesting a man who keeps being surprised by the same thing without managing to stop being surprised by it. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's a long ride. You too. She called the boys in and finished the lesson and fed them and put them to bed. She sat alone at the table for a while after, with the lamp burning low and the wind outside doing what it did to this country in the late season. And she thought about the 4 men at the creek crossing, and the letter in the document case, and the long ride to Ridgemore. And she thought about Thomas, who had signed papers in a shaking hand while she held the page steady. And she thought about what it meant to hold things steady, and how long she had been doing it, and how much further there was still to go. Then she went to bed, and she slept, and in the morning they rode. The road to Ridgemore was cold and straight, and they rode it mostly in silence, which by now was a kind of language between them. Not absence of communication, but a specific quality of it. 2 people who had learned that not everything needed to be said to be understood. Ruth Weber had taken the boys without ceremony, which was exactly the right way to take them. She had opened the door, looked at Owen and Eli, said there was bread to bake, and would they like to learn? And Owen had said yes before Evelyn had finished the sentence about how long they'd be gone. Eli had looked at his mother for a moment, the particular look he had, the one that meant he was reading the situation and filing his conclusions. And then he had gone inside too. Evelyn had not looked back when they rode out. She had found, in the weeks since Harlan's crossing, that looking back was a thing she needed to ration carefully. The document case was in her saddlebag. She had put it there herself, in the specific way you pack something you cannot afford to lose, checking twice, then a third time. 4 copies of Miss Agnes's letter, the county recorder's correspondence, the statement Alcott had taken, and a summary she had written herself in the evenings, careful, precise, in the flat language of someone who has read enough legal documents to understand that clarity is more persuasive than emotion. Cole had read the summary 2 nights ago without comment, and then he had read it again, and then he had said, "This is good." 2 words, but the way he said them told her they were the accurate words and not the polite ones. The county recorder's office in Ridgemore was a 2-room building beside the courthouse with a sign that had been repainted recently, the letters still bright against the weathered wood. The recorder, a man named Elias Pruitt, was in his 60s and had the precise, unhurried manner of a person who has worked with documents long enough to understand that most human urgency is temporary, but paper is permanent. He recognized Cole when they came in. He recognized the document case when Evelyn set it on his desk. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Cole said, "wrote a summary of the material we discussed last week." Pruitt looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man revising an expectation. She had seen that expression before. She was not offended by it. Or rather, she had decided not to spend energy on offense when she could spend it on other things. "May I?" he said, indicating the case. "That's why we're here," she said. He read slowly. He was the kind of reader who moved his attention like a tool, methodically, missing nothing, going back to re-examine the places that warranted re-examination. Evelyn sat in the chair across from his desk and watched the window. Cole stood near the door. The office smelled of paper and ink and the particular dry warmth of a wood stove that has been burning all morning. When Pruitt finished, he set the pages down and aligned their edges carefully, which she had already learned was his habit when he was thinking seriously. "The Harding parcel," he said, "and the Porter situation." "They'll speak to it," Evelyn said. "I have their agreement, though not in writing yet. I didn't want to put anything on paper without knowing what form the inquiry would take." Pruitt looked at her again, and this time the expression was different. "You've done this kind of work before," he said. "I kept my husband's books for 6 years and managed his ranch accounts for 3. Different kind of work. Same habits of mind." He nodded, slowly. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a form and uncapped his pen. "I'm going to open a formal inquiry into the filing irregularities," he said. "That gives me authority to request the original documents from Harlan's Crossing for comparison. It also means the matter becomes part of the county record, which makes it considerably harder for anyone to make it disappear." "How long does the inquiry take?" Cole asked. "In normal circumstances, 2 to 4 weeks." Pruitt did not look up from the form he was filling out. "These are not normal circumstances. I'll apply for an expedited review on the basis of the material scope." He paused. 1 week. Possibly 10 days. Evelyn looked at Cole. He was looking at the window the way he looked at the fence line, reading the landscape for information. "Crail's going to know about this inquiry the same day you file it," he said to Pruitt. "Almost certainly." "Which means we have less time than we thought." "Almost certainly," Pruitt said again. They rode back faster than they had ridden out. The cold had deepened through the afternoon, and the wind was in their faces, and Evelyn rode with the document case secured across her body rather than in the saddlebag, a decision she had made without articulating it, and which she did not articulate now. Cole was slightly ahead, and she watched his posture as they rode. The specific quality of his attention, the way he scanned the road and the surrounding land without appearing to scan it. She had watched him do this every time they traveled, and she had stopped remarking on it because it was simply the way he moved through the world, and the world was currently the kind of place that rewarded that kind of attention. He pulled up at a rise a mile outside of town, and she came up beside him and followed his gaze without asking. 2 horses at the western tree line, standing still, not moving, not grazing, just standing, in the way horses stand when they are being held. "Watchers?" she said. "Or they're waiting to see which road we take back. Can they see us from there?" "Yes." She looked at the horses in the trees. They were too far to see the riders clearly, but the riders were there. She could see the shapes. "We should go a different way," she said. "We should." He didn't move immediately, which meant he was thinking about something else. "They already know we went to Ridgemore. Whatever we do now, they know that apart. So they're not trying to stop us. They're reporting." "Yes." "To Crail." "Yes." He turned his horse south, away from the direct road. "Come on." They came back by a longer route, adding 40 minutes, and arrived at the Weber farm in the early dark to collect the boys. Ruth came out with Owen before they had dismounted. Owen with flour on his coat and the contained energy of a child who has been busy and is ready to not be contained anymore. Eli came out behind Ruth, and he looked at his mother in the specific way that asked and answered several questions simultaneously without using any words. "Fine," Evelyn said to him quietly. "Everything went fine." He nodded. "Good enough." They had 6 days before Crail moved, not 10. Cole knew it was coming 2 days before it happened, in the way you know weather is coming when you have spent enough years reading a particular landscape. The signs were not dramatic. A fence post on the north boundary cut cleanly, not broken, cut, with a tool, deliberately. The sound of horses moving in the dark on the second night, not close enough to be at the fence line, but close enough to be heard. A visit from a man Cole didn't know who rode up to the yard and said he was looking for a ranch hand position, and looked at the house and the outbuildings in a way that had nothing to do with looking for work. Cole sent the man away and then told Evelyn that evening, "I think we have 2 days, maybe 3. She was at the table with the figures she had been maintaining, a running record of every relevant document, every conversation with a date and name attached, every piece of evidence organized in the way she organized everything, which was with a thoroughness that sometimes surprised even her. "What does he do when he moves?" she asked. "Historically, he sends men with papers, writs, restraining orders from a compliant judge in his county. The papers are usually irregular. He gets them too fast for the process to be clean. But by the time anyone challenges them, the property has changed hands, and the challenge is expensive enough that most people don't pursue it. What's about us specifically? We're not property he can claim anymore. The settlement papers are legitimate. He'll reframe it. The kidnapping story is still out there. Cole was near the window, not looking through it. My guess is a writ requiring you and the boys to appear before a Harlan's Crossing judge to testify about the circumstances of your removal. If you appear, you're in his county. If you don't appear, he gets a default judgment, and the legitimate paperwork stops being the story. She sat with this. It was a clean trap, the kind designed by someone who had done it before and understood that the best traps look like legitimate process. We can't run, she said. Running validates his story. No. And we can't stay and wait for his men to arrive with papers we have to answer. No. So what do we do? Cole was quiet for a moment. It was the particular quiet she had come to recognize as the space before he said something he had been thinking about for a while but hadn't said yet. Something that had been working in him below the surface of the daily business of managing the ranch, and managing the threat, and managing all the ordinary necessities of 4 people living in close quarters under sustained pressure. We go to him, Cole said. She looked up from the table. Not defensively, he said, not running. We ride to Krail's headquarters, and we make the confrontation happen on our terms, in front of people who matter, before he can manufacture the paperwork to change the legal landscape. He turned from the window. I've been in contact with some of the Valley ranchers, Weber and a man named Callum Price, who runs the largest cattle operation north of the creek, and 2 others who have been sitting quiet because they didn't have anything solid to stand on. The material from Miss Agnes's tin box and your copies of the county filings gives them something to stand on. You've been organizing this, she said. It was not a question. For the past week, yes. She looked at him steadily. She was not angry. She understood why he had done it without telling her, which was that he wasn't certain it would work, and he hadn't wanted to offer her something that might not materialize. She understood it, and she also wanted him to know she would have preferred to know. Next time, she said, tell me while you're doing it. All right. How many? 5 ranchers, including Weber and Price, and Roy Alcott. He's not going to put on his badge for this. He's outside his jurisdiction. But he'll come as a witness, and he'll be armed, which is a different kind of persuasion. 6 men, she said, against Krail's hired guns. We're not going there to shoot anyone. Cole sat down across from her, which he rarely did. He was more often standing, moving, and the act of sitting down gave the moment a different weight. We're going there with evidence, in front of witnesses, and we're going to make it impossible for him to proceed without the entire Eastern Valley knowing exactly what he's done. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about Miss Agnes's letter, copied 4 times at a kitchen table by lamplight. She thought about Pruitt's formal inquiry, which was now a matter of county record. She thought about the Harding family and the Porter situation, and all the other pieces she had been assembling for weeks. And she thought about how a confrontation would either crystallize all of it into something actionable or scatter it into nothing, depending on how it was done. He'll have men there, she said. Yes. Armed men, who have been paid to protect his interests. Yes. What happens if they don't back down? Cole looked at her across the table. Then it gets complicated, he said. It was not, she thought, a satisfying answer. It was also probably the honest one. When, she said. Day after tomorrow, before he can move first. She closed the figures book and put her pencil down. I'm coming with you. Evelyn, the evidence is mine as much as yours. The statement is mine. Miss Agnes gave the letter to me. If this is a confrontation designed to establish who has the facts and who has the fraud, then I need to be there. She folded her hands on the table. And I am considerably more composed under pressure than you might think. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I know you are. That's not the issue. Then what is? The boys. She had already thought about this. Ruth Weber. I'll ask her tonight. He was quiet again. She had learned to wait out his quiet, the way you wait out the specific silences of a landscape you've come to know. All right, he said finally. But you stay behind me when we ride in. I'll stay where I'm useful, she said, which may or may not be behind you. He looked at the ceiling briefly, which was the closest thing to exasperation she had seen from him. Fine, he said. She went to the Weber farm that night and spoke to Ruth, who said yes without asking for details, which was the quality that Evelyn had come to value most in Ruth Weber. The woman understood when the situation spoke for itself. She rode back in the dark on a route she now knew well enough to travel without thinking about it. And the cold was clean and deep and the sky was very clear. And she thought about Thomas, who had believed in the essential fairness of things and had been wrong about it, and she thought about what it meant to keep moving anyway. They rode out before dawn, all of them, Cole and Evelyn, and the 5 ranchers and Alcott, who wore civilian clothes and kept his badge in his pocket and his rifle in his scabbard with the ease of a man who is accustomed to both. Callum Price was larger than Cole in every dimension, taller, broader, louder, with a voice that carried without effort and a presence that filled the available space. But he deferred to Cole in the way that practical men defer to whoever has thought the situation through most thoroughly, which Cole had. He had explained the plan to Price and Weber and the others at the Weber farm the previous evening, and they had agreed to it with the specific agreement of men who understand that the alternative is worse. The plan was this. They rode to Crail's headquarters, which was a compound 3 miles south of Harlan's Crossing, a main house, 2 outbuildings, and a bunkhouse where his hired men stayed. They arrived in the early morning, before the working day had begun, when Crail would be present and his men would not yet be deployed. They requested a meeting. They conducted the meeting in the open air, in full view of anyone present, with the documents visible and the witnesses present. And they said exactly what they had, clearly and without theater, so that it was on record. What could go wrong? Price had asked. Cole had said, most things. Price had nodded as though this was the answer he expected and had agreed to come anyway, which told Cole something about Callum Price that he had already suspected. They arrived at Crail's compound as the sky was going from black to gray, that particular frontier dawn that feels like the world deciding whether to continue. The gate was a heavy timber frame with a man in it, one of Crail's hired hands, young, with the flat, watchful expression of someone doing a job, and not entirely comfortable with how big the job had gotten this morning. Cole stopped at the gate. Tell Crail that Cole Maddox is here with the Eastern Valley Ranchers, and that we'd like a conversation. The man looked at the group. 7 riders, the document case visible across Evelyn's body, Price with his particular quality of contained mass on a horse that was barely big enough for him, and went inside without a word. They waited. Evelyn kept her hands loose on the reins and her back straight. Alcott was to her left, slightly behind, and she could feel his attention the way you feel a fire in a cold room, not looking directly at it, but aware of its heat. Crail came out 10 minutes later. He was dressed for the day, which meant he had already been awake, which meant he had been told they were coming. Not that morning, but before. He had known. She could see it in the absence of surprise on his face, the way a man looks when he has been expecting a thing and is performing the discovery of it. He had known they were organizing. He had let it happen, or had been unable to stop it, and now he was going to try to manage it. He stopped in the gate and looked at them. Then he looked at Evelyn with the same expression he had worn on the platform in Harlan's Crossing, the performance of boredom, the implication that she was a detail rather than a principle. And she felt the same cold clarity she had felt then, except this time it was not the feeling of a door closing. It was the feeling of one opening. Mr. Maddox, Crail said, this is trespassing. We're at your gate, Cole said, not on your property. And we're asking for a conversation, which you're welcome to refuse, in which case we take what we have to the state land office, and the matter becomes considerably more public and considerably more out of your control. Something moved in Crail's expression. It was brief and quickly managed, but she saw it. The slight compression around his eyes that meant he was doing fast arithmetic. What do you have? He said. Not a question, a measurement. Cole looked at Evelyn. She opened the document case and held up the pages in a way that was clear without being theatrical. The filing irregularities Recorder Pruitt documented, she said. A letter from Harlan Crail, your father, describing the acquisition scheme in operational detail, dated 6 years ago. Statements from the Harding family and from the Porters regarding fraudulent debt claims on their properties, and a summary, notarized in Ridgemore, of the pattern of acquisition across 11 Eastern Valley parcels over 6 years. She looked at him directly. 4 copies. One is already with the state land office. The arithmetic behind Crail's eyes was running faster now. 2 of his hired men had appeared behind him in the compound. She could see them in the gap beside the main house, moving slowly into view with the deliberate casualness of men who want to be available without appearing to have positioned themselves. She counted 2. There would be more she couldn't see. She kept her eyes on Crail. This is a conversation about whether the next step is a county inquiry or a state investigation, Cole said. Those are different things, with different timelines and different consequences. We're giving you the opportunity to address the county inquiry voluntarily, which is considerably preferable to the alternative. You're threatening me, Crail said. I'm describing your options, Cole said. That's different. Crail looked at the ranchers. He looked at Weber, who met his gaze steadily. He looked at Price, who did not bother to meet it because Price had decided this situation did not require him to perform anything. He looked at Alcott, who was in civilian clothes, and Evelyn saw the moment Crail recognized him, a slight hardening around the jaw, and understood that Alcott's presence meant the conversation had a law enforcement witness, regardless of what Alcott was wearing. What exactly are you proposing? Crail said, and the word proposing was careful. It was the word of a man who was listening now, which was different from the man who had walked out of the gate. You release all claims on Eastern Valley properties seized under the fraudulent filing scheme. You cooperate with Pruitt's inquiry, and the matter of Mrs. Ashcroft and her sons is considered permanently and publicly settled. Cole kept his voice level. In return, the ranchers here agree not to pursue additional litigation beyond the inquiry, and what happened is addressed as a civil matter rather than a criminal one. It was, Evelyn thought, a more generous offer than Crail deserved. She had said this to Cole the night before. Cole had said, generous offers get accepted more often than just ones. She had not entirely agreed, but she understood the logic. Crail was quiet. Behind him, his hired men had stopped moving. Not because they had been told to, she thought, but because they were reading the situation the way people read a room that has changed, and the room had changed. 6 ranchers and a law enforcement witness, and a woman with 4 copies of a letter describing your father's fraud was a different room from the one Crail had planned to manage this morning. I want to see the letter, Crail said. No, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. Cole with something that might have been surprise. Crail with the return of his controlled expression. You don't need to see it, she said. You know it exists because your father wrote it and because you have been operating the same scheme for the past 3 years. What you need to decide is whether you want a county inquiry or a state investigation. Those are the only 2 choices available to you right now. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. The weight of a decision being made by a man who had spent 6 years making decisions in the opposite direction and was now, for the first time, genuinely uncertain of his ground. Then, from inside the compound, a different voice. Rough and flat, and carrying the specific authority of someone who has decided to move before the decision is made. Don't give them anything, Bernard. She turned. A man had come out of the main house, not through the gate, but around the side of it, and he was moving toward the fence with a purpose that had nothing to do with conversation. He was one of the hired men she hadn't been able to see from the gate, older than the others, with the build and posture of someone who had been doing this kind of work for a long time and had his own opinions about how it should be done. His hand was at his hip. Cole said, very quietly, "Don't." The word was so flat and so certain that it stopped the man mid-step in the way a wall stops you, not with force, but with the pure fact of its presence. The man looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him with an expression that Evelyn had not seen before. Not anger, not threat, just an absolute absence of anything negotiable. Price moved his horse forward 1 step, which was enough. Weber did the same. The 2 hired men who had been drifting into view behind Crail had gone very still. Alcott had not moved at all, but his hand had moved, and it was no longer visible, and everyone present understood where it was. The hired man looked at the group. He looked at Crail, who had turned to look at him, and on Crail's face, for the first time since he had walked out of the gate, was something that was not controlled, something that was, in its small and specific way, afraid. "Garrett," Crail said, "go inside." The man named Garrett looked at Cole one more time. Then he turned and went back the way he had come, and the particular quality of his departure said he was not done and would not be done, which was information Evelyn filed and did not say anything about. The silence reorganized itself around the absence of Garrett. "The Harding parcel," Crail said, and his voice had changed again. Not capitulation, but the tone of a man who is recalculating what position he can defend. "And the Porter land." "And the Kimball parcel," Evelyn said, "and the 3 other fraudulent filings Pruitt has already identified." "That's—" He stopped. He was doing the arithmetic again, and this time it was taking longer, and she could see the shape of what it cost him. Not the land itself, but the scheme, the architecture of 6 years, the thing his father had built, and he had continued with the quiet confidence of a man who believed the structure was too solid to be threatened. She had been thinking, in the weeks of copying documents and keeping records and mapping the shape of what had been done, about what it meant to dismantle something. It was not dramatic, usually. It was the removal of one piece at a time, finding the load-bearing elements and taking them out in the right order. She had watched a barn dismantled once, on a neighboring property, when she was 12. Watched the men work methodically, taking the boards in sequence, and the barn had not collapsed dramatically but had simply, gradually, ceased to be a barn. She thought about that now, looking at Crail. "The inquiry is already open," Cole said. "Pruitt files his report in 7 days. What you decide in the next 10 minutes determines what that report contains." Crail looked at the ranchers. He looked at the documents Evelyn was holding. He looked at the gatepost briefly, and she thought she saw him look at it the way a person looks at something they are calculating the distance to. "I'll need my lawyer," he said. "Send for him," Cole said. "We'll wait." They waited. It was cold, and the sky had gone from gray to a flat pale white that meant the day would be sunless, and Evelyn sat her horse and watched the gate and the compound and the places where Garrett and the other men had been, and thought about the boys at Ruth Weber's farm making bread and asking questions. And she thought about how much she wanted this to be the last morning she spent in the company of this particular kind of fear. Crail's lawyer arrived an hour later on a horse that had been ridden hard from Harlan's Crossing, a thin man named Foss, who carried his own document case and who read what Evelyn presented with the speed of someone used to reading bad news quickly. He spoke to Crail in low tones near the gate for several minutes. Crail shook his head twice. Foss spoke again. Crail looked at the ground. Then Crail looked up and said, "The Harding parcel and the Porter parcel, and the Kimball claim." "All 6, Evelyn said. "Mrs. Ashcroft, all 6 properties," she said. "That is not negotiable. Those are the 6 Pruitt has documentation for, and those are the 6 that will appear in his report regardless of what happens here. You're not gaining anything by holding 2 of them back." Foss touched Crail's arm and said something else. Crail's jaw tightened. "All 6, Crail said finally. Cole looked at Alcott. Alcott nodded, a small, specific nod that meant what needed to mean. "Then we're going to need that in writing," Cole said. "Today. Your lawyer and our witness and a document that Pruitt can attach to the inquiry record." It took another 2 hours. Foss wrote, and Evelyn read every word of what he wrote and corrected 3 terms that were ambiguous in ways that mattered, and Foss looked at her the same way Pruitt had looked at her. The recalibration, the revised expectation, and she did not comment on it. Cole signed. Crail signed with the pen held slightly too hard, a small and human thing that she noticed and remembered. Garrett did not. When it was done, they rode away from the compound in a group and did not speak much for the first mile. The cold had deepened and the road was hard under the horses' feet. Price came alongside Cole and said low, "That man Garrett, he's not done with this." "No," Cole said. "He's not." "Crail either." "A signed document makes the next move harder," Cole said. "Not impossible. Harder." Price was quiet for a moment, thinking about this in the way that practical men think about practical problems, which is by looking at them from every accessible angle. "You think he'll try to go around it?" "I think a man who built 6 years of fraud doesn't stop because he signed a paper." Cole glanced back briefly, though the compound was no longer visible. "But we took his leverage. Without the fraudulent claims, he's just a man with a lot of land and a signed agreement and a county inquiry on record. That's a different position than he was in this morning." Evelyn was listening to this from slightly behind them, and she was thinking about Garrett, the flat certainty of his voice when he said, "Don't give them anything, Bernard," the way he had looked at Cole before he went back inside. Not the look of a man who was calculating odds, the look of a man who had already decided and was waiting for the right moment. She thought about it for the rest of the ride home, and she did not say anything about it, because she had not yet determined what the right thing to say was. And until she did, saying the wrong thing seemed worse than saying nothing. They collected the boys from Ruth's farm as the light was beginning to fail. Owen came out with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, which Ruth had apparently made him bring, and he handed it to Evelyn with a formality that was belied by the flower still on his collar. Eli came out behind him and looked at his mother's face and appeared to read it in the way he read most things, thoroughly and without needing to be told the key. "It went all right," Eli said. Again, not a question. "Mostly," Evelyn said. "Mostly all right or mostly not all right?" "The first one." She took the bread from Owen and put it in the saddlebag. Come on, it's cold. On the ride home, Owen said to Cole, with the directness that had become his specific mode, "Did you have to shoot anyone?" "No," Cole said. "Were you going to? If you had to?" Cole looked at him sideways. "Let's not borrow trouble we didn't have." Owen appeared to consider this. "Eli bet me you wouldn't have to," he said. "I bet you might have to." Eli was right. "He usually is," Owen said, without any apparent resentment, which was one of the more interesting things about Owen Ashcroft, that he could acknowledge his brother's accuracy without it costing him anything. Evelyn had watched this dynamic for 2 months now and still wasn't entirely sure how it worked. She suspected it was simply the specific arrangement of those two particular people, and that trying to explain it was like trying to explain weather. They came back to the ranch in the dark and put the horses up and went inside, and Evelyn made supper from what they had and the boys ate without being told to be quiet, which meant the silence in the house had changed. Not the provisional silence of the past 5 weeks, but something slightly different, slightly less weighted. Cole sat at the table after the boys had gone to bed, and the supper things were done, and he looked at the document case where it sat on the shelf, and Evelyn sat across from him, and neither of them spoke for a while. "Garrett," she said finally. "Yes," Cole said. He had been thinking about it too. She could see it in him. He's Crail's man, not his hired man, his man, the kind that doesn't let go when the employer signs a paper. "I know what he is," Cole said. "What do we do about him?" Cole put his hands flat on the table. She had noticed he did this when he was thinking about something with his whole body rather than just his head. The hands, the stillness, the particular quality of his attention turning inward. "We document everything from here forward," he said. "Every fence cut, every approach, every man we see near the property line. We date it, and we describe it, and we keep it." He looked up. "Because if Garrett moves, I want there to be a record that he moved." "Alcott," she said. "I'll write to him tomorrow." She nodded. Then she said, "You told Crail that generous offers get accepted more often than just ones." "I believe that." "And if the just ones are the only ones that actually solve the problem?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then you find out when you get there," he said. She looked at the document case on the shelf. 4 copies of a letter from a dead man describing a scheme that his son had continued and that had cost the Ashcroft family everything, and the Valley family's years and land, and in some cases more than that. The letter was evidence. The signed agreement was evidence. The inquiry was evidence. All of it was evidence, carefully gathered and organized and distributed so that it could not easily be made to disappear. She had built this. She and Cole had built it, but she had built most of the structure, the copies, the summary, the record-keeping, the conversations with Ruth and Miss Agnes, and the Hardings and the Porters. She had done it in the evenings after the boys were in bed, and in the mornings before they were awake, and in the hours between, working with the focused steadiness of someone who understands that the alternative to doing it is not doing it, and what not doing it costs. Thomas would have found another way. He would have tried to negotiate, to find the decent impulse in people and appeal to it. She loved him for that, and she had loved him for it while it was killing him, and she understood now, not with bitterness but with clarity, that decency appealed to was not the same as decency deployed. You had to deploy it yourself. You had to do the work. "I'm going to bed," she said. "Good night," Cole said. She stopped at the hallway. "Cole?" He looked up. "You said the morning we left the platform in Harlan's Crossing that whether it was family or something else, we'd figure it out." She kept her voice level. "Have you figured it out?" He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp was behind him, and she could not read his expression precisely, but she could read the quality of the silence he made, which was careful and genuine and not evasive. "I'm working on it," he said. She nodded once. "All right," she said, and went to bed, and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her. The particular sounds of this specific place that she had been learning for 2 months, and that had become, without her quite deciding it had, something that sounded like home. Garrett made his move on a Thursday. Cole had been expecting it in the way you expect a thing you cannot prevent, not with anxiety exactly, but with a quality of readiness that had become, over the 2 weeks since the confrontation at Crail's compound, a permanent condition. He slept lighter. He noted the state of the fence lines each morning with the specific attention of a man who is reading a sentence he knows will eventually say something he doesn't want to hear. He had written to Alcott the day after the confrontation, as he'd told Evelyn he would, and Alcott had written back within 4 days. A careful letter that said, between its lines, That Alcott had made his own inquiries in Harlan's Crossing, and what he had found there was not reassuring. What Alcott had found was that Garrett's name was Ellis Garrett, and that Ellis Garrett had been in Crail's employ for 9 years, and that in those 9 years, 3 people who had posed significant problems to Crail's operation had encountered significant problems of their own. One had lost a barn to fire. One had had livestock poisoned. One, a man who had been prepared to testify to a county commission about fraudulent land transfers, had been found at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles from his property, his horse nearby. The circumstances described officially as an accident and described unofficially by people who knew the terrain as nothing of the kind. Cole had read Alcott's letter at the kitchen table in the morning before the boys were up, and then he had read it again, and then he had folded it and put it in the document case with everything else, because documentation was the discipline they had committed to, and he was not going to break it now. He had not told Evelyn about the man in the ravine immediately. He had told her that evening, directly, without softening it, because that was what they had agreed, that she would know what there was to know. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long ago?" 4 years? And Garrett has been working for Crail since. Yes. She had nodded slowly, in the way she nodded when she was filing something. She had not asked what Cole intended to do about it, because she had learned by now that the question was answered in the doing, and that asking it prematurely produced nothing useful. She had gone back to what she was working on. But in the following days she had varied her routes when she went anywhere outside the ranch, and she had started keeping the boys closer, and she had, without saying anything about it, moved a certain kitchen knife from the counter to a location that was more immediately accessible. Cole had noticed. He hadn't said anything either. It was a language they were both fluent in by now. The Thursday morning arrived with a pale sky and no wind, which was unusual for that time of year, and Cole was out at the north fence line at first light when he heard the horses. Not one or two, several, moving together at a pace that was not casual. He came over the rise and counted 5 riders approaching the ranch from the south road, and he recognized Garrett at the front from the posture, from the way the man sat a horse with the particular economy of someone who has never developed the habit of appearing relaxed. Cole was on foot. His rifle was back at the barn. He did not run. Running produces panic, and panic produces errors. He walked back toward the barn at a pace that was slightly faster than his normal pace, and arrived there with enough time to get the rifle and be at the yard fence when Garrett and his 4 men rode through the outer gate, which Cole had left unlocked. Another error, or another habit, the price of 2 weeks without an incident. Evelyn came out of the house before he could signal her not to. She came out and stood on the porch and looked at the 5 riders, and then looked at Cole, and then looked at the riders again, and he could see her assessing in real time, doing the calculation he was doing, arriving at the same conclusion he was arriving at. The boys were inside. He did not know if they had looked out the window, and he did not look at the house to check, because looking at the house would tell Garrett where his attention was. Garrett pulled up 15 feet from the yard fence and looked at Cole with the expression Cole had seen at the compound, the man who had already decided. He was not carrying anything visible. None of the 4 men behind him were carrying anything visible, which was the part that was most wrong, because men who come to a ranch at dawn with nothing in their hands have something in their purpose. "Maddox," Garrett said. "Garrett." Cole held the rifle in a way that was present without being aimed, pointed down, both hands on it, the posture of a man who is not the one starting this but is prepared to respond to whoever does. "You're on private property. Crail sent me with a message. Crail can send his messages through his lawyer. You know that." Garrett looked at Evelyn on the porch. He looked at her with a flatness that was worse than hostility. Hostility would have had some human content to it. "The agreement Crail signed," he said, "has been reviewed by a judge in Harlan's Crossing. The judge has questions about the circumstances under which it was signed, specifically about whether there was coercion." Cole absorbed this. It was clean work. Not Garrett's work, someone else's, Foss probably, the thin lawyer who had written the agreement while Evelyn corrected his language. A challenge to the validity of the agreement would not succeed, not with Pruitt's inquiry on record and Alcott as a witness, but it didn't need to succeed. It needed to create uncertainty, delay, a legal cloud over the signed document while Crail regrouped. "Then Crail's lawyer can file with the county recorder," Cole said, "and the recorder can respond. That's the process." "Crail doesn't feel that the process has been working fairly," Garrett said, with the specific neutrality of a man reading from a script he had agreed to perform before coming here. He can take that up with the state land office, which has a copy of the relevant documents and has already acknowledged receipt. Cole kept his voice level. Is that the message? Garrett looked at him. The four men behind him had spread slightly. Not dramatically, not enough to seem threatening unless you were watching for it, which Cole was. Two to the left, two to the right, Garrett in the center. A spread designed to occupy peripheral vision, to make it difficult to watch all 5 points at once. The message, Garrett said, is that the situation has become complicated and that Crail believes a direct conversation between himself and you, without lawyers or county officials or a crowd of ranchers, would be more productive. Where? His office. This afternoon. Cole said nothing for a moment. Evelyn said from the porch, "No." Both men looked at her. If Crail wants the conversation, it happens in Ridgemore, in the county recorder's office, with Pruitt and Alcott present, she said. Those are the terms, and they're not negotiable, and you can tell him I said so. Garrett looked at her with the flatness again. Then he looked back at Cole. The woman doesn't speak for you, Maddox, Cole said. She does, actually. There was a silence. One of the four men shifted in his saddle. The man on the far left had his hand on his thigh in a position that was casual and wrong, and Cole had been tracking it since they spread, and he was tracking it now. The man on the left, Cole said, without changing his tone, needs to put his hand on the saddle horn. Both hands. The man on the left did not move immediately. Then Garrett turned his head very slightly toward him, and the man put both hands on the saddle horn. Cole did not relax because there was nothing to relax into, but the specific quality of the moment changed. Something released, some increment of pressure, not gone, but redistributed. Tell Crail what Mrs. Ashcroft said, Cole said. Ridgemore, Pruitt's office. With Alcott. Those are the terms. Garrett looked at him for a long time. It was the look of a man who is measuring something, not the odds of this particular moment, but the longer arc of the thing, where it goes from here, what the next shape of it is. Cole had the feeling, standing in his yard in the cold, pale morning with a rifle he had not raised, that Garrett was smarter than Crail and had been managing Crail's operation with more genuine understanding of it than Crail himself possessed. That was useful information and dangerous information simultaneously. I'll tell him, Garrett said, and turned his horse, and the four men turned with him, and they rode back through the outer gate the way they had come. Cole stood at the fence until they were out of sight. Then he went to the gate and latched it. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn on the porch. You all right? He said. Yes. She was still looking at the road where Garrett had gone. He's not going to accept Ridgemore. No. So that was a visit to take a measure of us, not to deliver a message. Yes. She came down off the porch and stood beside him at the fence, and they both looked at the empty road for a moment. He counted the fence line, she said, when he was in the yard. I watched his eyes. He was counting the posts. Cole looked at her. That's a detail. He's a detail man. She turned and went back into the house. At the door, she stopped. Owen saw everything from the window, she said. He'll want to talk about it. I know. Don't tell him it's fine. I wasn't going to, Cole said. He went inside, and Owen was at the kitchen table, and he was not performing calm, which Cole had learned to appreciate about him. Owen Ashcroft was many things, but he was not a performer. He was 8 years old, and he had watched 5 armed men come into his yard at dawn, and he was sitting at the table with his hands flat on it, and his jaw set in a way that looked like his mother's jaw when she was managing something. Who was the one in front? Owen said. Cole sat down. A man named Garrett. He works for Crail. What did he want? To see how we responded. Owen thought about this. That's what Eli said. Cole glanced at Eli, who was near the window and who had apparently said this to Owen before Cole came in, which meant he had been thinking about it with some accuracy. Eli was right. Are they coming back? Probably. With more men? I don't know yet. Owen was quiet. The set of his jaw did not change. Can I learn to shoot? He said. Cole looked at him steadily. Not yet. Why not? Because right now the most useful thing you can do is what your mother has been teaching you. Reading, figures, knowing how things work. He kept his voice even. The men who are going to solve this problem are men who know how things work, not men who can shoot. Owen looked at him with the expression of someone who is hearing this and registering it and is not entirely satisfied but is willing to hold the argument for later. All right, he said. Good. Cole stood up. Eat something. We have work to do. Cole wrote to Alcott that afternoon, a longer letter this time, describing the visit and what Evelyn had observed about Garrett's behavior, and attaching the documentation he had kept since the confrontation at the compound. He also wrote to Price and to Weber and to the lawyer in Cartwell, named Dolan, who had been corresponding with Cole about the water rights angle, and who had written back 2 weeks ago with something significant. What Dolan had found, and what Cole had been sitting on while he determined how to use it, was a state water compact that governed the Eastern Valley Creek system. The compact was 20 years old and most people had forgotten it existed, but it was legally binding and it established that no single entity could hold a controlling interest in more than 40% of the creek access points in the valley. Crail's acquisitions, properly mapped, had taken him to 63%. This was not a county matter. This was a state matter, and state matters moved differently. Cole had not told Evelyn about this yet, not because he was keeping it from her, but because Dolan had asked him to wait until the legal analysis was complete before discussing it with anyone. And the analysis had arrived only that morning in the same post as Alcott's letter about the ravine. He told her that evening after supper with Dolan's letter on the table between them. She read it carefully, the way she read everything carefully. She read it twice. Then she put it down and was quiet for a moment. "This supersedes the county inquiry," she said. "It operates alongside it. The inquiry addresses the fraud. This addresses the water compact violation. They're separate claims. But together they're considerably more than either one alone," Cole said. She was thinking. He could see it. The specific quality of her thinking, which was not circular the way some people's thinking was circular, going over the same ground repeatedly. Hers moved forward. It took a thing and carried it to its next position and examined that, and then carried it further. "If the state opens an inquiry on the compact violation," she said, "Crail can't resolve it by cooperating with Pruitt. He'd have to answer to the state." "State, yes. Which means the agreement he signed at the compound becomes evidence in a larger case, not just a local settlement." "Yes. And Garrett," she said, "what Garrett does now, any of it, becomes evidence too." Cole looked at her. "That's why I want everything documented." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "You should have told me about Dolan's water compact angle when you started working on it." "I know." "Not after the fact." "I know, Evelyn." She looked at him. He did not look away. There was a moment between them that was not comfortable and was also not destructive. One of those moments in a relationship of any kind where the friction is honest and both parties know it and neither party is going to pretend otherwise. "All right," she said finally. "What do you need from me?" "Your summary document needs to be updated to include the compact violation data, Dolan's analysis as an attachment, and we need to get the updated version to Pruitt and to the State Land Office before the end of the week. I can have it by tomorrow morning." "Can you—" "Tomorrow morning," she said, in the tone that meant the conversation about the timeline was over. "I'm going to name them. I want you to write down each name in the order I give it. Can you do that?" "Yes," Owen said, straightening up. Cole gave him the names, one by one, and Owen wrote them in his careful, slightly too large handwriting. Eli's handwriting was smaller and neater. Owen's was larger and more forceful, pressing the pencil down as though he wanted to make sure the words stayed. When he was done, he handed the list back. Cole looked at it. "Good," he said. "Now go back to bed." Owen looked at the list. Then he looked at Cole. Then, and this was a thing Cole would remember, he said, "Are we going to win?" The word "we" did the thing to Cole that it sometimes did when one of the boys used it. A small catch, somewhere in the chest, in a place he had been managing for 2 months with the same discipline he applied to everything else. He looked at Owen steadily. "I think so," he said. "I'm not going to tell you I know so, because I don't. But I think so." Owen nodded. Then he went back to bed, and Cole heard his feet on the floor, and then nothing, and the house was quiet again. Evelyn did not say anything about the exchange. She went back to writing. Cole went back to his letter. Outside, the freeze settled in hard and the ranch creaked in it, the way old structures creak. Not with weakness, just with the acknowledgement of a season changing. Pruitt's inquiry report was released on the 12th day, 3 days after Cole had delivered the updated summary with Dolan's water compact analysis attached. It was 70 pages, which surprised everyone, including Cole, and it documented with Pruitt's characteristic precision. Not just the 6 properties they had brought to him, but 9 others he had identified through his own examination of the filing records. Properties seized under the same irregular documentation scheme going back to the elder Crail's original letter. 15 properties in total, over a 12-year period, across 3 counties. Alcott brought the report to Cole personally. He rode up on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Garrett's dawn visit, and Cole saw him coming from the fence line and had the particular feeling of a man who knows the thing he has been working toward is either arriving or failing, and will know which in the next 10 minutes. Alcott swung down in the yard and handed the report over without ceremony. Cole took it. He read the executive summary, the first 3 pages, standing at the fence post while Alcott waited with the patience of a man used to delivering documents that take a while to absorb. Cole looked up. 15. 15, Alcott said. Pruitt also found correspondence between Harlan Crale Sr. and 2 county officials who are no longer in office, which he has referred to the state attorney as a separate matter. Cole was quiet for a moment. How is Crale taking it? Voss filed an objection within 4 hours of receiving his copy. It's formal, it's detailed, and according to Dolan, it won't succeed, but it buys time. Garrett, Alcott's expression shifted slightly. Garrett resigned from Crale's employ 3 days ago, according to the man Price has in Harlan's Crossing, who knows these things. Cole looked at him. He resigned. That's the word. Cole thought about this. A man like Garrett did not resign. A man like Garrett repositioned. He detached from the employer who was legally compromised and made himself available for what came next, which was either working for someone else or finishing the job on his own account, depending on what the job meant to him personally. The question was whether Garrett felt the job was finished or whether it had become something beyond employment. Where is he? Cole said. Unknown. Alcott met his eyes. That's the part I wanted to tell you in person. Cole nodded. He folded the report and tucked it under his arm. Come inside, he said. Evelyn should hear this. Evelyn heard it at the kitchen table, reading the executive summary herself while Alcott gave the rest of it in plain language. She read faster than Cole had read, she always did, and she had the particular quality of attention that he had come to associate with her processing something that had both good and bad dimensions simultaneously, her face not showing either one clearly, but moving between them in small, controlled increments. When Alcott was done, she said, Garrett's dangerous. Yes, ma'am. More dangerous without the employment structure than with it. That's my assessment as well. She set down the report. What do you need from us, Deputy? Alcott looked slightly surprised by the directness of the question, which Evelyn's directness still occasionally produced in people who were not yet accustomed to it. I'd like to have a man out here, not official, someone Price or Weber can spare for a few weeks, until we know Garrett's location and intentions. Price already offered, Cole said. I'll tell him yes. Good. Alcott stood up and then paused, which was the posture of a man who has something else to say and is deciding how to say it. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, I want you to understand that the report, what you put together, the summary, the evidence you gathered, that's what made this possible. Pruitt said as much. He said he'd had suspicions about the filing irregularities for 2 years, but nothing organized enough to open a formal inquiry. What you brought him was organized enough. Evelyn looked at him. Then she looked at the table. It was a brief look, a few seconds, and then she looked back up. Tell Pruitt I appreciate that, she said. After Alcott left, she sat at the table for a while without doing anything, which was unusual enough that Cole noticed it and did not speak. He made coffee and put a cup in front of her and sat down across the table and waited. 15 families, she said eventually. Yes. Some of them for 12 years. Yes. She was quiet again. The coffee cooled in front of her. Thomas and I were one of them, she said. We were in the middle of it and didn't know. She paused. I keep thinking about who could have stopped it earlier, if someone had organized earlier, if... Evelyn. She looked up. You stopped it, he said. That's the thing that happened. The rest of it is a conversation about a different world. She was quiet for a moment. I hate that you're right, she said. I know. The ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but close enough. She picked up the coffee cup. Outside, one of Price's men, a solid, quiet fellow named Bert, who had arrived the day before and was sleeping in the outbuilding, moved across the yard doing the perimeter check Cole had asked him to do every morning, and Cole watched him through the window and thought about Garrett and the specific quality of unknown locations and what they meant when the person in the unknown location was a man who had already decided. Garrett came back on a Friday, 11 days after the report. He came back alone, which was the part Cole had not expected, and he came not from the road but from the western tree line in the late afternoon when the light was low and orange and full of shadow, and he was on foot, which was the part that changed everything. A man on foot in rough terrain at dusk with no visible reason for being. There is not a man who has come to talk. Bert saw him first, from the outbuilding, and came to the barn where Cole was working fast enough that Cole knew before Bert said a word. Cole took the rifle and went out the side door rather than the front, and moved along the fence line in the shadow of the barn, putting the building between himself and the direction Bert had pointed. He saw Garrett 30 yards out, moving toward the house. Not toward the barn, toward the house. Cole said his name, not loudly, just loudly enough. Garrett stopped. He turned, and in his hand was something that caught the low light. Not a rifle, a shorter thing. And Cole said, "Put it down, Garrett. Don't." Garrett was looking at him. The calculation was happening. Cole could see it in the set of the man's body, the slight shift of weight, the assessment of distance and angle, and the specific arithmetic of a man who is deciding whether the odds have changed enough to matter. Cole had done similar arithmetic himself, in different circumstances, years ago, and he understood the shape of it. "Crail's finished," Cole said. "Whatever he paid you, it doesn't cover this." "Crail didn't pay me for this," Garrett said. His voice was flat and even, and Cole heard in it something he had not heard at the compound or in the yard, the specific register of a man who is not performing, at the compound. Garrett had been performing, the message delivery, the spread of 5 riders, all of it theater. This was not theater. This was something he had decided to do on his own account, which was both more dangerous and, in a way Cole could only partially articulate, more understandable. Crail was the employer. The fraud was Crail's. But Garrett had spent 9 years being the instrument of it, and the report, 15 families, 12 years, had put his name on the public record in a way that had no comfortable resolution. "You're on the record," Cole said. "Alcott has your name. Dolan has your name. Pruitt's report has your name." He kept the rifle level. "Whatever happens here tonight, your name is on record." Garrett was still looking at him. His weight had not shifted back. "The man in the ravine," Cole said. 4 years ago." Something moved in Garrett's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. And I think you know that Alcott is looking at that as well, and that the state attorney is going to have questions, and that right now the only question is whether what happens tonight makes that situation better or worse for you." Cole took one step forward, which was a risk and a statement simultaneously. "It gets worse, not better. Whatever you do here, it gets worse." Garrett's grip on the thing in his hand had not relaxed, but his weight had shifted, marginally, a degree, the kind of shift you see in a man who is reconsidering something he was committed to a minute ago. The reconsideration was not complete. It might not complete. Cole was aware of this the way you are aware of standing on ground that might hold and might not. Bert had come around the other side of the barn and was visible at Garrett's peripheral edge, not close, but present and armed. Garrett did not turn to look at him, which meant he had already accounted for Bert before Cole spoke, which meant he had been watching the property for longer than Cole had known. "The house," Garrett said. "What about it?" "Is the woman there?" Cole did not answer that. He held the rifle and held Garrett's eyes and did not answer it, because the answer, whatever it was not going to be Garrett's to use. "I'm not here for her," Garrett said. "I want that understood." "Then what are you here for?" Garrett was quiet. The orange light had gone and the dusk was deepening into something more honest, and in the low light Cole could see the man's face more clearly than he had been able to all afternoon. The specific texture of a person who has done things they cannot undo and has arrived at a point where the inability to undo them has become the primary fact of their existence. It was not remorse exactly. It was something more pragmatic than remorse and harder to name. Exhaustion, maybe. The exhaustion of a man whose plan has run out. "I need to talk to the deputy," Garrett said. "Alcott." Cole looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Bert and gave a small nod, and Bert lowered his weapon by a degree that was not a surrender, but was an acknowledgement. "Put down what you're carrying," Cole said, "and I'll send for Alcott tonight." Garrett looked at what was in his hand. Then he bent and placed it on the ground and straightened up and put his hands at his sides in a posture that was deliberate and clear, and that cost him something visible. Cole came forward and picked it up. A short-barreled pistol, loaded. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Garrett. "Come up to the barn," he said. "Not the house." They went to the barn. Bert went with them. one step behind Garrett, which was the right place, and both of them knew it. Cole sent Bert for Alcott on Bert's horse, the fastest route, and then he and Garrett sat in the barn with the horses shifting in their stalls and the cold coming up through the floorboards, and Cole held the rifle across his knees, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Eventually, Garrett said, "The Hardings." Cole looked at him. "Their parcel. I was the one who signed the delivery notice on the fraudulent filing, not Crail. Me." His voice was flat and factual. "I need to make sure they know that, for whatever that's worth." Cole did not respond to this immediately. He sat with it, the specific gravity of it, what it meant for Garrett to say it, and why he was saying it now, in a barn, to a man pointing a rifle at him. It did not change what had been done. It did not restore the 12 years. It was a man arriving at a place where the weight of a thing had become heavier than the benefit of not saying it, and that was a human place, a real place, and Cole acknowledged it without saying so. "Alcott will want to know that," Cole said, finally. "I know," Garrett said. Outside, the night had come fully in. Through the barn wall, Cole could hear the ranch, the cattle, the wind starting to move again after days of stillness. The ordinary sounds of a place that was still here, still functioning, still itself. He thought about Evelyn in the house, who had heard none of this, and would hear all of it before the night was over. He thought about the boys, asleep or pretending to be asleep, and about what Owen had asked, "Are we going to win?" And about the answer he had given, which was honest because it was not certain, and was not certain because nothing in this had ever been certain, not from the moment he had walked through a gap between two buildings on his way to find a farrier and stopped a hammer with his voice. Alcott arrived before midnight, and what followed was not simple and was not quick, and involved a second deputy who came with Alcott and a set of formal procedures that turned the barn into something more official than a barn is designed to be. Garrett spoke for 2 hours. Cole sat through it because Alcott had asked him to, and he listened to the account of 9 years the way you listen to something that answers questions you had not known how to ask, not with satisfaction, because satisfaction was not what the account produced, but with the specific altered weight of a man who now understands the full shape of a thing he has been fighting half blind. When it was done, Alcott stepped outside with Cole for a moment. The night was very cold and very clear. "He'll cooperate with the state attorney," Alcott said. "His lawyer will negotiate the terms, but Foss is already cooperating on Crail's behalf, and the combination of both is going to be more than enough for the state to proceed." "Crail," Cole said. "He was arrested this afternoon in Harlan's Crossing." Alcott said it simply, without theater. "The sheriff down there is not Crail's, as it turns out. He was waiting for the state to have enough to act." He paused. "The auction records from Harlan's Crossing are being subpoenaed. All of them." Cole was quiet for a moment. "How many auctions?" "At least 9, Alcott said. "Yours was the only one someone stopped." The cold settled between them. Cole looked at the clear sky and the specific number of things he could not have changed, and the specific number of things he had. "Is it over?" he said. "The criminal part is beginning," Alcott said. "The rest of it, restoring the properties, the civil claims, the water compact violation, that takes longer, months, maybe more." He looked at Cole steadily. "But Crail is in custody. Garrett has turned. The inquiry is on record. The leverage is gone." He paused. "It's as over as things get, in my experience." Cole nodded, slowly. He went back to the house. He went inside and took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door. And the kitchen was warm, and there was a lamp burning on the table, and the document case was on the shelf where it always was. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and listened to the house, the particular sound of 3 other people breathing in other rooms, the sound of a structure that contained people, which was a different sound from the structure he had lived in alone. Evelyn came out of her room. She had not been sleeping. She came out in her house clothes with her hair down, which he had not seen before, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at him and read his face with the thoroughness she brought to reading everything. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He sat down at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and he told her all of it, Garrett, and what Garrett had said, and Alcott, and Crail, and the auction records, and the 9 other auctions that no one had stopped. He told it in order and without softening it, and she listened in the way she listened, which was completely, missing nothing, filing everything. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned between them and the house was still, and the cold outside was the clean cold of a night that has finally settled into what it is. 9 others, she said. "Yes." She put her hand on the table, flat, the way he put his hands flat when he was thinking with his whole body, and she looked at it for a moment. Those families, she said, they'll be part of the state inquiry. Their situations will be addressed. Addressed. She said the word like she was examining it. That's a word that does a lot of work. Yes, he said. It is. She looked up at him. Her face in the lamplight had the particular quality he had been learning for 2 months. The face of a woman who carries things without needing you to know she is carrying them, who has made the carrying into a kind of discipline, and who is, right now, carrying the weight of 9 other families in 12 years, and a scheme that had run long enough to become ordinary and was only now being named for what it was. Owen asked me yesterday if we were going to win, she said. He asked me the same thing, weeks ago. What did you tell him? I told him I thought so. She looked at the lamp for a moment. I told him the same thing, she said. Then, we were both right. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the dark, Bert was doing the perimeter check that would not be necessary much longer, moving around the fence line with the steady patience of a man who has been given a job and intends to do it properly until he is told the job is done. The cattle made the sounds cattle make at night, low, patient, self-contained. The lamp burned with the specific steadiness of a flame that has not been told to be steady, but simply is. Cole looked at Evelyn across the table. She looked back. There were 1,000 things in that look, and neither of them said any of them, because the look itself was enough, and they were both people who understood the specific economy of enough. Get some sleep, he said. You too. She went back to her room, and Cole sat at the table for a while longer, alone with the lamp and the quiet and the document case on the shelf, and the particular feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not plan to go and is still in the process of understanding what it means that he is there. He did not reach a conclusion. He was not a man who needed conclusions before he could move. He blew out the lamp and went to bed, and the house settled into the deep quiet of a night that had finally, by some long and complicated route, become what it needed to become. The state inquiry took 4 months. That was the thing nobody told you about justice when you were in the middle of fighting for it, that it moved at the pace of institutions, which was to say slowly, carefully, with the maddening thoroughness of a process designed to be difficult to challenge rather than easy to complete. Evelyn had understood this intellectually. She had read enough legal documents by that point to know that process was the point, that the slowness was a feature rather than a defect, that a system which moved fast in one direction could move fast in the other, and that the careful pace was its own kind of protection. She understood it. She was still not good at waiting. The winter settled in hard over the Eastern Valley, the kind of winter that frontier country produces without apology. Weeks of cold that did not vary much, snow that came and stayed rather than melting and returning, the particular enforced intimacy of 4 people in a house that was adequate for 1 and workable for 4 if everyone understood that workable was not the same as comfortable. They learned each other's habits in the specific way that close quarters teaches, the things that could be tolerated, the things that required management, the things that simply had to be accepted because there was no alternative. Owen was loud in the mornings and needed to be outside by midday, regardless of weather, or his ears became an instrument of general suffering. Eli was quiet at breakfast and sharpest in the evenings, and he read anything put in front of him with the focused concentration of a person for whom reading is less a skill than a need. Cole woke before everyone and was in the barn by the time the boys got up, and he came back in for breakfast and ate without talking much, which Owen sometimes attempted to remedy by talking enough for both of them, which Cole received with a patience that Evelyn suspected was genuine rather than performed because she had never seen it crack. Evelyn herself worked. She had always worked, and she worked now with the particular purposefulness of a woman who had looked at the shape of her situation from every angle and decided that the most useful thing she could do with the 4 months of waiting was make the ranch function better than it had before she arrived. She reorganized the larder. She repaired 3 sections of interior fencing that had been manageable problems becoming unmanageable ones. She corresponded with Pruitt's office, with Dolan the water rights lawyer, with Alcott, and eventually, as winter turned and the inquiry ground forward, with the families whose properties were being addressed by the state process. The Hardings wrote first, a letter from the eldest son that was short and careful, and ended with a sentence she read 3 times. We did not know that anyone was going to help us, and then there was you. And that she put in the document case without discussing it with anyone, because it was hers, and she was not going to make it into a moment. Agnes Kimball wrote in February a long letter in a handwriting that was still precise and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who had always understood that words on paper lasted longer than words in the air. She wrote about her husband, who had kept the tin box because he didn't trust any of them. She wrote about the 30 years they had spent in the Eastern Valley and what it had looked like before Crail's operation had begun its slow work of narrowing the available life. And at the end she wrote, "What you did with those copies of my husband's letter was what he would have done if he had been younger and less tired. He would have been glad to know it was done." Evelyn sat with that letter for a long time. Cole found her at the table with it one evening and did not ask about it, which was correct. He made a coffee and put a cup near her and went and sat in the other chair and read the surveying manual he had read 3 times already, which was what he did when he needed to occupy his hands without his mind. And the kitchen was quiet in the good way it could be quiet now, not the provisional quiet of people waiting for something bad to happen, but the ordinary quiet of people who have come to know each other well enough that silence is not a gap to be filled. "She says her husband would have been glad," Evelyn said eventually. Cole looked up from the manual. "Agnes Kimball, about the letter, about what I did with it." She folded the letter and put it on the table. "I keep thinking about what it means to do the right thing too late versus doing it at all. Whether too late still counts." Cole was quiet for a moment. "You think it counts?" "I think it has to count," she said. "Otherwise, what are we saying? That things which can't be made perfect should not have been attempted?" She shook her head. "Thomas would have said that. He would have said it gently, and he would have meant it kindly, and he would have been wrong." Cole looked at her. She had mentioned Thomas more in the past month than in all the weeks before it, which he took as a sign of something settling in her rather than something reopening. "He was wrong about some things," Cole said carefully. "He was wrong about several things," she said, without bitterness. "He was also right about things that mattered. He was right that this land was worth fighting for. He just didn't have the tools to fight for it the way it needed to be fought." She put both hands around the coffee cup. "I did. I just didn't know I had them until I needed them." This was true, Cole thought, and it was also incomplete, and the part that was incomplete was something he had been thinking about without saying for several months. "You had the tools," he said. "You also needed a reason to use them." She looked at him. "A platform in a square," he said. "An auctioneer's hammer. Without that specific thing, you go somewhere else with the boys, and you rebuild somewhere else, and you fight smaller battles." He looked at the manual in his hands. "Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's better, even for you personally, safer, less of all of this." "Are you saying you shouldn't have stopped the hammer?" "No," he said. "I'm saying I didn't stop it for you. I stopped it for a reason I didn't understand at the time and am still working out." He paused. "That's a different thing from having helped you, and it's a different thing from being glad it happened." She studied him with the thoroughness she brought to everything she studied. "The morning 8 years earlier," she said. He looked up. "You mentioned it once, the first week. You said you had a theory about why you stopped, that it had to do with a morning 8 years earlier when you'd failed to stop something." She kept her voice even. "You don't have to tell me, but I've been thinking about it for months." Cole put the manual down on the table. He was quiet for longer than his usual quiet. The specific quality of a man arriving at a decision that has been sitting in him for some time and is finally ready to be made. Outside, the wind moved across the valley with the particular sound of late winter wind, the sound of a season that is not yet finished and knows it. "I had a family," he said. "A wife, a daughter, who was 4. He looked at the table. "We were on a ranch in the South Territory. There was a man, a creditor, not unlike Crail's operation, though smaller, who came to collect a debt that my wife's father had run up before he died. I was not there. I was 3 days out on the range when he came." He stopped. He continued. "By the time I got back, the debt had been collected in a different form. My wife had been taken. My daughter, too. I spent a year trying to find them." He looked up. "I found my wife. My daughter was—" The trail went cold. 8 years ago. It has not warmed." Evelyn did not say she was sorry. She understood, he thought, that sorry was not the right response to something that had no consolation available to it. She looked at him with the clear-eyed steadiness that was her specific quality, the look that neither flinched from difficult things nor made them into more than they were. "You stopped the hammer," she said, "because you didn't stop a different one." Something like that. "And then you stayed," she said, which was a different decision. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Are you still looking for your daughter? I have a man who looks, periodically. He writes when there's something to write. Cole's voice was level. There hasn't been something to write in 4 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup and then at the letter from Agnes Kimball on the table and then at Cole, and what she felt was not pity. She did not think he wanted pity, and she was not a person who offered what was not wanted. What she felt was something more precise than pity and more durable. The feeling of understanding a person in a way that does not reduce them, but instead adds dimension. The way a landscape looks different and fuller once you understand the geology under it. If it warms, she said, you go. Whatever else is happening here, you go. He looked at her steadily. Evelyn, that's not a question, she said. That's a condition. If the trail warms, you go find your daughter and you don't worry about anything here. The ranch will be managed. The boys and I have been managing things before you arrived and will manage them after. She said it with a finality that meant she had thought about it and decided it and was not going to revisit the decision. Do you understand? He understood. He also understood, sitting at the kitchen table in February with the wind outside and the letter from Agnes Kimball on the table between them, that this was perhaps the most specific and practical form of care that Evelyn Ashcroft knew how to offer, and that it cost her something to offer it, and that she was offering it anyway because she was the kind of person who did what was right when she had determined what was right, and he was not going to diminish it by arguing with her. All right, he said. She picked up the letter and put it in the document case. Then she stood up and said, get some sleep, which was what she said at the end of conversations that had gone somewhere significant, and he had come to understand that it was not a dismissal but a form of care, her way of saying that the conversation had been enough, that it had done what it needed to do, and that the next thing was rest. He got some sleep. Bernard Crail was convicted in March on 11 counts of fraudulent land transfer, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The state attorney had wanted more charges and had been persuaded to accept these on the basis that they were airtight, and that the others, while likely provable, would take another year of litigation that the affected families could not afford to wait for. Evelyn read the conviction notice in Pruitt's letter, which arrived on a Tuesday morning while Owen and Eli were doing their lessons at the kitchen table. She read it twice, as was her habit with important documents, and then she set it on the shelf beside the document case. What is it? Owen said. Crail was convicted, she said. Owen's pencil stopped. Eli looked up from the book he was reading, which was not the lesson book but the novel with no cover, which Cole had finally identified as a collection of frontier stories by an author who had never become famous and deserved better. What does that mean? Eli said. It means he goes to prison, Evelyn said, for what he did to the families in this valley. For what he did to us, Owen said. For what he did to us, Evelyn agreed, and 15 others. Eli looked at the book in his hands and then at his mother. Is it over? He asked, and it was the same question he and Owen had been asking in various forms for months. The same question Cole had asked Alcott in the cold outside the barn the night Garrett came. The question that turned out not to have a single answer, but a series of them, each one addressing a different layer of the thing. The criminal part is over, Evelyn said. The civil part takes longer. Getting the properties back to the families takes longer. She looked at both of them. But the part where Crail can hurt anyone else? That's over. Owen absorbed this. Then he said, what happens to us now? It was the question that had been present in the kitchen for months, hovering at the edge of practical conversations about garden planning and fence maintenance and the price of cattle and correspondence with lawyers. It had been present and not asked because Evelyn had not been ready to answer it, and Owen had, in one of the more remarkable pieces of restraint she had observed in her son's 8 years, understood this and waited. I've been thinking about that, she said. She had been thinking about it for a long time. She had been thinking about it since February, since the conversation at the kitchen table with Cole and the letter from Agnes Kimball, and the condition she had stated and he had accepted. She had been thinking about it in the mornings in the garden when the first tentative green things began to come up through the soil, the garden that she had rebuilt from the wreckage of Cole's neglect, that was now producing things, that had the look of something that intended to continue. She had been thinking about it when she looked at the fence lines that Cole maintained with the steady attention of a man who intends to maintain them for a long time, and when she watched him work with the boys in the evenings, teaching Owen to read a fence post for stress, teaching Eli the basic principles of irrigation, doing it with the patience of a man who has decided these are things worth teaching. Tell me later, Eli said, and went back to the novel. Owen stared at his brother. How can you just... She said she's been thinking about it, Eli said, without looking up. That means she has an answer. She'll tell us when she's ready. He turned a page. Finish your figures. Owen looked at his mother. Evelyn raised her eyebrows slightly, which was her version of, your brother is right. Owen turned back to his figures. She took Pruitt's letter and put it in the document case. She looked at the document case for a moment. The accumulated weight of months, all that paper, all those copies, all those evenings of lamplight and careful handwriting. The case was full now, in a way it had not been when Cole had brought it back from Ridgemore that first trip. Full in the way things get full when they have done their job and are ready to be set down. She thought about setting it down. Cole came in from the barn at midday, and she told him about the conviction notice, and he nodded in the way he nodded when something had been expected and had happened as expected. Not satisfied exactly, more like a man crossing an item off a mental list that is long enough that crossing one item does not change the overall length significantly. Foss is cooperating with the state, he said. Dolan wrote last week. The water compact violation settlement is going to be concurrent with the criminal sentencing. When? End of April, possibly May. He poured coffee. The Harding family got formal notice of restoration yesterday. Their parcel reverts to them as of the 1st of next month. She leaned against the counter. And ours? He looked at her over the cup. The Ashcroft Ranch. The original parcel. He set the cup down. Dolan says it's the cleanest case. The fraudulent filing date is documented, the deed is clear, the restoration should be straightforward. He paused. It could be ready by April. She looked at the window. The Ashcroft Ranch was 20 miles south and 2 years empty, and represented everything she and Thomas had built together, and everything the drought had taken, and everything Crail had attempted to take with it. She had not been there since the morning the foreclosure papers arrived. She had not gone back because going back, while things were unresolved, would have been the kind of looking back she had learned to ration. But things were resolving now. Things were, by the slow and imperfect standards of the process she had helped set in motion, being addressed. I need to go look at it, she said. I know. Not to decide anything, just to look. I'll take you, he said. This week, if you want. She looked at him. The kitchen was mid-morning quiet, the boys at the table with their work, the sound of the ranch outside. Cattle, wind, the ordinary productive sounds of a place that was alive. This week, she said. They rode south on a Thursday, leaving the boys with Ruth Weber, who had by now become a fixture in their lives. A reliable, practical, warmly unsentimental woman who fed the boys aggressively and asked them good questions and called Owen by his full name when he was being ridiculous, which was a thing he needed and that Evelyn had come to be genuinely grateful for. The Ashcroft Ranch was worse than she had prepared herself for, which was something. The house had lost a window to weather, and the front steps had rotted enough to be dangerous, and the barn had a section of roof that had partially collapsed under the winter snow. The fencing was down in 4 places. The garden? She had planted a kitchen garden years ago, and had maintained it through the drought with water she carried by hand when the irrigation failed, was entirely gone. Not even the ghost of Rose remaining, just grass and the encroachment of the land reasserting itself over the worked earth. She stood in the yard and looked at it for a long time. Cole stood a few yards away and looked too, and neither of them said anything for a while. It needs a lot of work, she said. Yes. The structure is sound, she said, looking at the house. The bones of it. Thomas built it to last. She walked to the house and put her hand on the doorframe, which was still solid. Good timber, well-joined, the kind of work that holds up under neglect because it was done right to begin with. The window, the steps, the barn roof, those are repairs, not rebuilding. 6 weeks of work, Cole said. Maybe 8. She went inside. The inside was what abandonment does to an inside. Dust, the evidence of animals, the particular sad disorder of things left exactly where they were last used and then not used again. Thomas's coat was still on the hook by the door. She looked at it and looked away and went through the kitchen and into the back room where the accounts ledgers were kept. And she opened the cabinet and the ledgers were there, dust-covered but there. And she took one out and opened it, and the columns of figures were there in her own handwriting, her handwriting from 2 years ago, before the drought fully broke them. She closed the ledger and put it back. Cole was in the kitchen when she came back through, looking at the state of the stove, which would need work but was essentially intact. He looked up when she came in and read her face with the accuracy he had developed over months of reading it. "Well?" he said. "It's ours," she said. The word ours surprised her slightly when it came out. She had been thinking mine, which was also true, but ours was what she said, and she let it stand because it was honest. The boys and mine. It belongs to us, and it should be lived in. "Are you going to move back?" he said, not with any particular weight on it. A practical question asked by a person who wanted to know the practical answer. She looked at the kitchen. Thomas's kitchen, her kitchen, the kitchen she had worked in for 8 years. She looked at the window that was broken, and the stove that needed work, and the ledger cabinet with its columns of her own handwriting. Then she looked at Cole. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to think about it." "All right. Does that create a problem for you?" she asked. "At the ranch, if we leave." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "It doesn't create a problem." She nodded. Then she said, "Are you asking me to stay?" The question sat in the kitchen between them, in the dusty air of the abandoned house, beside the ghost of Thomas's coat on the hook by the door. Cole looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who said things he did not mean, and he was not a man who said things before he had thought them through, and she watched him think it through in real time. The consideration, the honesty of the consideration. "Yes," he said, "but not because of the ranch." She looked at him. "I know," she said. They rode back in the late afternoon, and the conversation did not continue, and neither of them needed it to. The answer she had given, "I don't know yet, I need to think about it," was the honest answer, and he had accepted it as such, which was the thing about Cole Maddox that she had come to understand over months. He accepted honest answers, even difficult ones, with the equanimity of a man who had been refused by life on a scale that made smaller refusals manageable. He did not press. He did not perform patience to cover impatience. He simply waited, and the waiting was itself a form of respect that Thomas had possessed in different ways, and that she had not expected to find again, and was still not entirely sure what to do with. She thought about it for the next 2 weeks. She thought about it while she worked, and while she taught the boys, and while she corresponded with Pruitt and Dolan, and while she wrote a letter to the 9 other families from Crail's auction records that Alcott had provided, because those families existed and their situations were part of the same inquiry, and she could not know about them without making contact, without making sure they knew what was available to them through the state process. 7 letters, each one individual, each one carrying the specific information that family needed. None of them a form letter because the situations were not the same, and form letters were for people who did not have time for the specific human truth of each case. She thought about what it meant to rebuild something versus what it meant to build something new. She thought about Thomas, who deserved to be thought about with honesty rather than just with grief, and about what Thomas would have made of all of this. The fraud exposed, the properties restored, and a man in Cole Maddox's position in the life of his wife and sons. She thought Thomas would have had complicated feelings, and that the complications would have been reasonable. She thought he would ultimately have been glad she was not alone. That was the kind of man he had been. Not without jealousy, but ultimately more interested in her well-being than in being right about it. She thought about the boys, who had made a decision with considerably less deliberation than she was bringing to the question. Owen had decided within the first month and had not revisited the decision, which was his way. Eli had decided more recently and more privately, and she knew it not because he had said anything. Eli rarely said the important things directly, but because of a conversation she had overheard between the boys in the early evening 2 weeks ago, when they thought she was in the other room. Owen had said, "What if she decides we go back?" And Eli had said, "She won't." And Owen had said, "How do you know?" And Eli had said, "Because she's already home. She just hasn't said it yet." She had stood in the hallway and listened to this and said nothing, and gone back to what she was doing. She had thought about it since. In the middle of April, on a clear morning with the valley showing the first real green of the season, she went to find Cole at the fence line. He was working the north boundary, the same fence he had been maintaining since she arrived, checking the posts and adjusting the wire with the methodical attention he brought to all maintenance. Not fast, not showy, just steady and thorough. She came up beside him and looked at the fence and then at the valley beyond it, the long green reach of the eastern valley, the creek line visible in the distance, the parcels whose boundaries she had memorized from the documents and could now map onto the actual landscape. The Harding parcel, the Porter land, the Kimball property, the 6 others. All of it in the process of returning to the people it belonged to, like water finding the level it was always trying to find. I'm going to fix up the Ashcroft house, she said. Start in May. Hire workers from Ridgemore who need the work. She looked at the fence. When it's livable, I'm going to put Agnes Kimball in it. She's been alone long enough and her house is in worse shape than mine. Cole looked at her. He had stopped working. The Ashcroft land stays in my name, she said. It's the boy's inheritance, and that doesn't change. She looked at him. But I'm not going to live there. If the question is still open. The question is still open, he said. Then we stay here, she said. The boys and I, if that's what you want. He looked at her for a moment. The real look. The look without performance. The look of a man who has wanted something for a while and is in the somewhat unfamiliar position of receiving it. That's what I want, he said. She nodded. Then she said, Owen is going to be insufferable about this. He's going to act like he orchestrated it. He'll get over it. He won't. He'll be telling the story for years. She pulled her coat tighter against the spring wind. Eli already knew. Cole looked at the fence post he had been working on. I know, he said. He told me 2 weeks ago. She stared at him. He told you? He came to the barn. He said, I think Mama's decided and she's going to tell you soon, so I thought you should be ready. Cole picked up the wire tool. I thanked him and told him to go do his lessons. Evelyn looked at the valley for a moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes up from somewhere genuine rather than being produced for the occasion. The kind she had not heard from herself in a long time. It was not a beautiful laugh. It was the laugh of a woman who has been through enough that laughter, when it comes roughly and honestly, and with the slight edge of disbelief that things can be funny again. Cole watched her laugh. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled, some long-held thing, quietly, like a door that had been left slightly ajar for 8 years finally coming to rest. Come on, she said when she was done. Those posts aren't going to fix themselves. She picked up the other wire tool from the ground where he had left it and went to the next post, and they worked the fence line together for the rest of the morning, talking sometimes and quiet sometimes, in the proportion that was natural to both of them, which was more quiet than talking, and none of it uncomfortable. The restoration notices came through at the end of April. Official documents from the State Land Office, countersigned by the county recorder, restoring 14 of the 15 properties to their rightful owners. The 15th was in mild dispute over a boundary line that had nothing to do with Crail and would be resolved separately through normal county process. Evelyn organized a gathering, not a celebration exactly. She was not a woman who organized celebrations, and the situation was not one that called for celebration so much as for acknowledgement, which was a different thing. She organized it at the Weber farm because Ruth had the space and the practical infrastructure for feeding a large group. And she sent letters to everyone involved. And on a Saturday at the end of May, the Eastern Valley families came. They came in various states of restoration. The Hardings came with their eldest son and 2 daughters, and the specific quality of people who have been through a long, difficult thing and are still in the process of understanding what it means that it's over. The Porters came quietly and sat near the edge of things in the way of families that have learned to be careful, a habit that would probably take a while to unlearn. Agnes Kimball came in a wagon driven by Price's man Bert, who had appointed himself her unofficial transportation provider at some point in the winter and seemed content with the role. Alcott came in his capacity as himself, rather than his capacity as a deputy, which was a distinction he managed by leaving the badge at home and arriving with a jar of preserves from his wife, who had apparently decided that the situation called for preserves. Dolan came from Cartwell, a long ride, and Evelyn shook his hand and thanked him, and he said, with the straightforward modesty of a competent man who does not need praise to know the quality of his work, that the water compact angle had been there for years, and he was glad someone had finally given him a reason to use it. Pruitt did not come. He sent a letter instead which was in character. The letter was brief and precise and ended. The Eastern Valley files have been organized and archived. Should any party require access for future reference, they are a matter of public record. I have rarely seen a body of documentation assembled with such thoroughness under such circumstances. It was a privilege to work from it. Evelyn read this letter once, quietly, and put it in the document case, and that was enough. The gathering was not organized. It was not a program or an event so much as a space where people who had been through the same thing, or related things, could occupy the same place together for an afternoon. Ruth fed everyone with her characteristic aggression, and no one went hungry. Owen moved through the crowd with a sociability that was entirely his own, talking to adults without the self-consciousness that most 8-year-olds bring to adult conversations, asking questions that occasionally startled people with their directness, and then charming them before they could decide to be offended. Eli found Agnes Kimball and sat beside her for most of the afternoon, which surprised no one who knew either of them, and the two of them were observed in deep conversation about what Agnes described afterward as everything and nothing, which was Eli's preferred conversational territory. Cole was present in the way he was present in crowds: peripheral, watchful, available, without being prominent, the specific quality of a man who is comfortable at the edge of things and does not require the center. Evelyn watched him from across the yard at one point and thought about what it meant to understand someone's particular mode of being in the world. Not the dramatic version of them, the version that makes a good story, but the daily version, the version that shows up at the fence line and works steadily and says the thing it means and no more. Thomas had been the other kind, the kind who filled the center, who was warmth and expansion and the drawing of people toward him by the specific gravity of his presence. She had loved that. She had needed it for a time, the way you need warmth in a cold season. But she was not a cold season anymore. She was something that had come through the cold and was in the business of building forward, and what she needed now was different. And what was different was standing at the edge of a yard in the late May afternoon, talking to Callum Price about water rights in the specific, unhurried way of two men who have already said everything dramatic and are now dealing with the practical remainder. She crossed the yard and stood beside him, and he moved slightly to include her in the conversation without making it a gesture, which was the kind of small human thing she had come to notice about him, the ways he made space without requiring acknowledgement for the making. Price looked at her with the warmth that large, confident men sometimes have when they have decided you have earned their respect. "Your work made this happen," he said. "Our work," she said. Price shook his head, not in disagreement, but in the direction of accuracy. "The documents you organized, the summary you wrote, the connections you made between the individual cases. That's what gave Pruitt what he needed." He looked at Cole. "Maddox stopped a hammer. You built a case." He looked back at her. "Both mattered, but that's the truth of which mattered more." She looked at Cole, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who is not going to argue with the assessment of someone he respects. "I had the material," she said. "Miss Agnes had the material. The Hardings had the material. They just hadn't had a reason to put it together." She looked at the yard, the families, the children, the long light of May falling over everything. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of situation. The evidence is usually there. It exists. People know, often, what's being done to them. What they don't have is someone willing to make the knowledge organized enough to be useful. Price was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We should have been doing this ourselves years ago." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He absorbed this without offense, which was a measure of the man. "What made you sure it would work?" he said. She thought about this honestly. "I wasn't sure," she said. "I was sure it was the only available option that wasn't giving up, and I was not prepared to give up." She looked at Cole. He said there's always another angle, and the problem is usually time. I believed him, so we made time work for us instead of against us. Cole looked at her. She looked back. Price observed this exchange with the perception of a man who has been watching people long enough to read what isn't said, and he smiled the smile of a man who has correctly understood something and is not going to remark on it. "Drink your coffee," Price said, and went to find Alcott. The afternoon stretched long in the May light, and children ran in Ruth's yard, and the Harding son found Eli, and they talked for an hour about something that neither of them later reported, and Owen organized a contest of some kind near the fence that involved running and a stick, and rules that were not entirely clear but appeared to produce a clear winner, which was Owen. Miss Agnes sat in the chair Ruth had placed for her near the wall and watched everything with the eyes of a woman who has outlived enough that she has stopped being surprised by the world and has arrived at a place that is not quite contentment, but is close enough to be called by that name on a good day. She called Evelyn over at one point in the late afternoon. "Sit," she said, and Evelyn sat on the bench beside her chair. "My husband would have liked you," Agnes said. "He liked people who did what they said they were going to do." "I'm not always reliable," Evelyn said. "Nobody is." Agnes looked at the yard. "But you know the difference between what matters and what doesn't. That's rarer." She was quiet for a moment. "The house." I start work on it next week, Evelyn said. It should be livable by August. It's good bones. Thomas built it to last, Agnes said. He did. He was a good man. Not a practical one in the end, but a good one. Yes, Evelyn said. He was. Agnes looked at Cole, who was across the yard now talking to Alcott and holding a cup of coffee with both hands the way he always held it. That one is both, she said. Rare combination. Evelyn said nothing. Not a compliment requiring response, Agnes said. Just an observation from someone who has had time to observe a lot of things. She folded her hands in her lap. Take the time you need. Don't take more than that. Evelyn looked at her. Agnes looked back with the specific expression of an old woman who has earned the right to say what she means and no longer has the patience for anything else. I hear you, Evelyn said. Good, said Agnes. The summer came in with the particular quality of summers in that country after hard winters, excessive, almost aggressive, as though the season had been storing itself up and was determined to make full use of the available time. The garden grew. The cattle were healthy, the fence lines held. The legal processes moved forward in their slow, institutional way, and Evelyn tracked them with the same systematic attention she had brought to all of it, writing letters and filing responses and making sure nothing fell through the gaps that these processes were always producing and that someone had to watch for. In June, a letter arrived from Cole's man, the one who looked periodically for things that might warm the cold trail. Evelyn was in the barn when Cole read it, and she came in to find him standing at the table with it and went still when she saw his face. It was not a face of grief. It was something more complicated than grief. The face of a man receiving information that is both good and devastating simultaneously, because it is happening 8 years after it should have happened, and in a world that has moved forward in the interval. She did not ask. She waited. She's alive, Cole said. His voice was even. She was found 3 years ago, a family in the Northern Territory. They didn't know. The man who found her didn't know who I was until recently. He stopped. She's 11. Her name now. They call her something different. She doesn't... He stopped again. Evelyn came and stood beside him, not close enough to be intrusive, close enough to be present. Go, she said. He looked at her. Remember what I said, she said. You go. You go now, and you don't stop, and you don't worry about anything here. She said it with the same finality she had said it in February, the voice of a person who has thought this through and made the decision and is not going to unmake it. The boys and I are here. The ranch is here. You go find your daughter. He looked at her for a long moment. There were things in that look she would carry for a long time, gratitude and grief, and something she could only describe as the look of a man who has been given back something he had stopped allowing himself to want. I'll be back, he said. I know you will, she said. Go. He went. He left the next morning before the boys were awake, and Evelyn stood in the yard and watched him ride out and did not look away. She looked until he was out of sight, and then she looked at the empty road for a moment, and then she turned and went back to the work of the day, because the work was there, and she was the kind of person who did the work. She told the boys at breakfast. Owen said, Is he coming back? Evelyn said, Yes. Owen said, How do you know? Evelyn said, Because he said so. Owen seemed to accept this, which was new, the specific new thing of Owen accepting her word on something without requiring additional evidence. He was growing, quietly, in the way children grow when the ground under them is stable enough that the growing can happen. Eli said nothing during this exchange. He ate his breakfast and finished his coffee, which Cole had started making for him in small amounts in February, and which Eli had adopted as a habit, with the completeness he brought to everything he adopted. When breakfast was done, he said, The north fence post, 3rd section, the wire's loose at the 3rd staple. Evelyn looked at him. Cole's been meaning to fix it, Eli said. I'll do it today. She looked at her 8-year-old son for a moment. This careful, perceptive child who had been reading situations accurately since he could speak, who had told his brother, She's already home, she just hasn't said it yet, who was now offering to fix a fence post because the man who usually fixed it was gone, and the fence didn't stop needing maintenance because of that. I'll help you, she said. They went out after lessons and fixed the fence post, Eli holding the wire while Evelyn worked the staple driver, and Owen came along because he was not going to be excluded from anything. and the three of them worked the north fence in the summer morning with the valley spread out before them, and the cattle doing what cattle do, and the sky doing what the sky does in good weather, being large and clear and entirely indifferent to human difficulty in the way that landscapes are, which is not coldness, but simply scale. Cole was gone for 6 weeks. They were not easy weeks, and they were not impossible ones. Evelyn ran the ranch the way she had run ranches before, competently, without drama, managing what needed managing and letting what could wait, wait. Price sent a hand when she needed extra labor. Ruth came twice a week. Agnes Kimball moved into the restored Ashcroft house in July, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, because the work crew from Ridgemore had been better than expected, and because Agnes had arrived in late June to inspect the progress and had quietly directed the workers with the authority of a woman who had been building and maintaining things for 70 years and was not going to watch people do it wrong. The letters kept coming from Pruitt, from Dolan, from the families, from a reporter in Ridgemore who had written about the Crail conviction and wanted to speak with the woman who had organized the evidence. Evelyn declined the interview and wrote back suggesting that Pruitt and Alcott were better sources, which was partly modesty and partly the honest assessment that Pruitt and Alcott's roles were the ones with official standing, and that official standing was what would make the story useful rather than merely interesting. She thought about what Price had said, that the evidence had been there, that people knew what was being done to them, that what they lacked was organization. She thought about it in the context of 9 other auction families, whose situations Alcott had shared and who were being processed through the state inquiry with the impersonal efficiency of a system doing what it was designed to do, adequately but without the specific attention that each case deserved. She thought about what it would mean to offer that attention. To do, for others, what she had done in this case, the organizing, the record-keeping, the connecting of individual situations into a coherent documented pattern that the system could act on. She was thinking about this, not as a plan yet, but as the beginning of one, when Cole came back on a Thursday afternoon in August. He came back the way he had come the first time, without announcement, through the gate, at a pace that was neither rushed nor theatrical. But he was not alone. Behind him on a gentle horse was a girl of 11, small for her age, with dark hair and Cole's quality of stillness, and eyes that were taking in everything about this place in the specific inventory mode that Evelyn recognized because she had done the same inventory herself when she arrived. The girl's name, her birth name, was Clara. She had been given another name by the family who had taken her in without knowing who she was, and she had answered to it for 8 years, and what she called herself now was still being worked out with the tentative honesty of a child and a father who had 8 years to close and were approaching it the only way available, which was slowly and truthfully and without pretending that slowness was not necessary. Evelyn came out of the house and stood on the porch. Cole pulled up in the yard. He looked at Evelyn, and she looked at him, and the look said what it needed to say, that he was back, and he had found her, and it was complicated and not finished and would probably never be entirely finished, but was the most important thing, and he had done it. "This is Clara," he said. Evelyn looked at the girl. The girl looked back at her with the specific wariness of a child who has been moved enough times to know that new situations require careful reading before trust is available. Evelyn understood this. She had watched Eli do the same thing, and she knew that the right response to it was not warmth deployed as a strategy. Children saw through strategic warmth before adults did, but simply being what you were, consistently, and letting the child decide. "Come inside," Evelyn said. "You've both been riding a long time." Clara looked at Cole. He gave her the smallest nod, and she dismounted and she came up the porch steps with the careful deliberateness of a person placing her feet on ground. She has not yet decided she trusts, and Evelyn held the door open and said nothing else, because nothing else was needed right now. Owen and Eli came out of the barn where they had been working and stopped when they saw the girl, and there was a moment of the specific suspended assessment that children do when they encounter each other, the rapid, unsentimental taking of measure that adults have largely lost the ability to do. Eli said, "I'm Eli. That's Owen." Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. "He told me about you." Owen looked at Cole with transparent and somewhat wounded curiosity. Cole looked back at him in the way that said, "Later." Owen, who was growing in the way she had noticed, accepted this without the argument he would have made 4 months ago. They went inside. Evelyn made supper, and the 5 of them sat at the table that had been built for one, the table that had seated 4 for months and was now seating 5. And the meal was not elegant and the conversation was not smooth. Clara did not talk much, and Owen talked for several people, and Eli asked one question at a time in the measured way that was his specific gift. And Cole ate with the specific quality of a man who is still absorbing something enormous and is doing it quietly because that is how he does everything enormous. At one point, Clara looked at the document case on the shelf. She looked at it for a moment, and then at Evelyn. "What's in that?" she said. "Documents," Evelyn said. "Evidence from something we were working on. Is it done?" "Mostly," Evelyn said. "The main part is done." Clara looked back at the case. "My father said you were good at it," she said. "Finding the thing that matters and writing it down." Evelyn looked at Cole, who was looking at Clara with the expression of a man who is learning his daughter for the second time, which was not the same as learning her for the first time, but shared certain qualities with it. He looked up and met Evelyn's eyes. "He's right," Evelyn said to Clara. "I am." After supper, after the boys were in bed and Clara was in the small room at the back of the house that had been the ranch hand's room and was now hers, Cole and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. The lamp was burning low, and the summer night was warm through the window, and the valley was doing what the valley did at night. Its own business, in its own time, in the way that land does when the human drama that has been playing out on its surface temporarily settles. "She needs time," Cole said. "Of course she does." "She may not—" He stopped. "I don't know what this is going to look like in 6 months, in a year." "No," Evelyn said. "Neither do I." He looked at her. "You're all right with that?" "I've been all right with not knowing for some time," she said. "It's a condition of the situation, not a problem to be solved." She folded her hands on the table. "She's cautious, she's observant. She spent 8 years learning to read situations accurately." She looked at the hallway. "She'll be all right. It will take time, but she'll be all right." "You sound certain." "I'm not certain," she said. "I think it. The same way you thought we were going to win. I think it. And thinking it is the useful thing, so that's what I do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you." She looked at him. He did not say what he was thanking her for, and she did not ask, because the specifics were not necessary. She understood what she was being thanked for, and she accepted it with the directness she brought to everything. "You're welcome," she said. The lamp burned between them, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet of a house that contains people who are, each in their own way, in the process of becoming what they are going to be. Not finished, not arrived. In the process, which is the condition that most resembles living when you are honest about it. People talk sometimes about the moment everything changed. They want it to be one thing, one decision, one morning, one hammer stopped in its arc. And it is true that Cole Maddox walked through a gap between 2 buildings on his way to find a farrier and changed the course of several lives by stopping. That is true, and it matters. But the thing that is more true, and harder to tell because it has less shape to it, is that what followed the stopping was the real story. The weeks of work and fear and record-keeping, the lamplight and the copied letters and the conversations in the kitchen, the fence posts and the garden and the children learning what it means when someone chooses you and then stays. The choosing is a moment. The staying is everything else. The Eastern Valley did not become a different place overnight. The families returned to their land and found it the way Evelyn found the Ashcroft Ranch, in need of repair, showing the marks of absence, requiring the sustained work of people committed to the long view. They did that work. Some of them struggled and some of them flourished, and most of them did something in between, which is the realistic outcome of most human endeavors. The creek water flowed without a single controlling hand, the way it had been designed to flow, distributed by a compact that had existed for 20 years and had finally been made real through the specific work of a woman who could not be good at doing nothing. Evelyn sent the reporter the story after all, eventually, not an interview, but a written account, organized and precise, documenting the Crail operation from the beginning and the process by which it had been dismantled. She sent it not for the fame of it, which did not interest her, but because she had come to understand that the story needed to be told in a form that lasted. Paper lasted longer than memory. She knew this. She had built her case on it. The account was published. It was read widely enough to matter, narrowly enough to be accurate. It mentioned Pruitt and Alcott and Dolan and Agnes Kimball's Tin Box and the network of Eastern Valley families who had held on to their documentation through years of pressure. It mentioned Cole Maddox and the stopped hammer. It did not mention everything, because no account mentions everything, and the things it did not mention were not lesser things but private ones, the kind that belong to the people who lived them and do not need to be public to be real. The document case eventually went to the county archives, where Pruitt cataloged it with the care he brought to everything. He labeled it precisely, in his neat hand, and filed it where it could be found by anyone who needed to find it. On the label, he wrote the case name and the date range, and then, below that, a single notation that was unusual for him, being more personal than his standard practice. Organized and assembled by Evelyn Ashcroft, Eastern Valley, in defense of her family and neighbors. All of them, when they are honest about it, will tell you the same thing in different words, that the most important decisions rarely feel important when you make them. That you stop a hammer, because you cannot walk past a woman standing on a platform with her sons and do nothing, and you discover later that the stopping was the beginning of everything. That you copy a letter by lamplight 4 times because the situation requires it, and you are not a person who leaves required things undone, and you discover later that those copies were the thing that made the rest possible. That you stay. That you work. That you build towards something you cannot fully see, in the knowledge that the building is worth doing even when the outcome is uncertain. Eli would have said, and said it once, years later, when someone asked him what he remembered about that time, that the most important thing was not the dramatic parts, not the platform in Harlan's Crossing, or the confrontation at the compound, or the night Garrett came. The most important thing, he said, was that every morning they got up and did the work. That the work was the thing. That the people who understood this, his mother, Cole, Miss Agnes, the Hardings, all of them, were the people who came through it, and that the understanding was not complicated, it was just hard to sustain, and sustaining it was the whole of the task. Owen would have said something more emphatic and less precise, and also essentially correct. And on a Tuesday morning in September, with the valley gold and green and the cattle fat and the fence lines holding and the garden producing more than 4 people and 1 cautious 11-year-old could consume, Evelyn Ashcroft looked at the ranch that had become her home, at the structure of it, the dailiness of it, the imperfect and necessary and continuing human project of it, and she felt something she recognized after careful examination as belonging. Not the belonging of having arrived somewhere perfect, the belonging of having built something true, with the right people, in the right place, at the cost of everything it actually cost, which was considerable and was worth it and was hers. She went back inside and put the coffee on and waited for everyone to wake up.